In the dim glow of candlelight, the worn parchment lies open, its ink fading but still breathing secrets that were never meant to see the light of day. The air is heavy, filled with the dust of centuries, as if the very room resists the unveiling of what is written. A voice begins to echo across time, telling us that this is not just another gospel, not just another forgotten fragment. This is something more dangerous, something that could alter the very foundations of faith. For within these forbidden words lies a suggestion of a truth buried beneath layers of silence, that Jesus of Nazareth, the figure who inspired billions, may have left behind not only teaching but flesh, blood, and descendants. The idea is shocking, almost blasphemous to those raised on the official story. We are told that Jesus' life ended on the cross, that he rose into heaven, and that his legacy is spiritual, not biological. But what if that was not the whole truth? What if his legacy was also human, passing quietly from generation to generation, hidden in plain sight? Imagine the weight of such a revelation. Empires have risen and fallen on less. Entire religions have fractured over a single word of doctrine. But a bloodline, a direct lineage from Christ, would strike at the heart of power itself. Our story begins here, in the space between faith and fear, between history and mystery. For centuries, whispers of this bloodline have surfaced in strange places, in gospels banned by the early church, in medieval legends carried across Europe, in secret societies that guarded truths too dangerous to reveal. And always, shadowing those whispers, came silence. Books burned, voices silenced, monuments erased. The deeper one digs, the more one realizes that history itself may have been shaped to conceal this possibility. The church, we are told, is a custodian of Christ's memory. Yet in that custodianship lies a paradox. To preserve one version of truth, others had to be destroyed. At the Council of Nicaea, centuries after Jesus' death, bishops debated what stories would become gospel and what stories would vanish forever. And in those debates, it seems, the possibility of a human bloodline was pushed into the shadows. The image of Mary Magdalene was rewritten, her role minimized, her voice silenced. Why? Because to admit her true position in the story might open the door to the one possibility that could shake the empire's hold, that she was not merely a disciple, but the carrier of Jesus' living legacy. Consider for a moment the human side of this mystery. Jesus was a man who walked, who ate, who laughed with his friends, who wept over loss. Is it so impossible to imagine that he also loved? That he formed bonds not only spiritual but human, bonds that left behind children? In many ways, the notion does not diminish him. It makes him more relatable, more human. Yet to those who built their power on the idea of divinity without flaw, such humanity was dangerous. As we step deeper into this investigation, we must balance on a razor's edge between evidence and speculation, between faith and forbidden history. There are fragments of texts found in the sands of Egypt, buried in monasteries, that speak in voices different from the canonical Gospels. They tell of a teacher who showed favoritism, who kissed Mary often, who entrusted her with secrets others could not bear. And though these words are disputed, they carry with them the weight of possibility. They suggest that the story we know is not the only story that was told. Now imagine the implications if the story of a bloodline were true. What would it mean for the church, for centuries of theology, for the power structures that rest on the belief that Christ's only legacy was spiritual? It would mean that his descendants walked through medieval Europe, perhaps hidden among royal families, their very existence a threat to papal power. It would mean that wars, inquisitions, even crusades might not simply have been about heresy or politics, but about silencing a dangerous truth. The mystery of the forbidden gospel is not simply about theology, it is about power. History shows us again and again that dangerous knowledge is not destroyed because it is false, but because it is too disruptive to be allowed. And so, across the centuries, the whispers have persisted. From the legends of Mary Magdalene arriving on the shores of southern France to the cryptic symbols of the Knights Templar, from hidden codes in cathedrals to the daring brushstrokes of Renaissance painters, the story has found ways to survive. A shadow narrative, passed from generation to generation, waiting for the moment it might resurface. And today, as scholars unearth lost texts, as science pushes into the realm of DNA and archaeology, the whispers grow louder. The forbidden gospel begins to feel less like myth and more like a key, one that could unlock a story long suppressed. Yet with each discovery comes resistance, as if some ancient guardian still hover in the background, ensuring the silence holds. So we stand at the threshold of a mystery. On one side, the comfort of the official story, a divine savior, untouchable, leaving behind only spiritual teachings. On the other side, a dangerous possibility, that he left behind flesh and blood, a lineage still alive today. Which version is true? Which is myth? And, perhaps most unsettling of all, why has the possibility of a bloodline been so carefully hidden for nearly 2,000 years? This is where our journey begins. In a darkened room with a forbidden gospel, a manuscript that whispers of a truth too dangerous to tell. From here, we will step into history's shadows, through the councils of emperors, the whispers of heretics, the coded art of masters, and the buried secrets of cathedrals. Piece by piece, we will follow the trail of the vanished bloodline. And with each step, we will ask ourselves, if the story we are being told is incomplete, what truth lies waiting to be found? The candle burns lower, shadows flicker, and the parchment waits. This is the beginning of a journey into the greatest mystery of all, the mystery of whether Jesus Christ's legacy was not only divine, but also human, carried forward in blood and bone, through centuries of silence and suppression. A truth hidden not just from enemies, but from the faithful themselves. A truth that could change everything we thought we knew. And so we end the first chapter not with answers, but with a question, the same one that has echoed in secret for centuries. What if the greatest story ever told is not the whole story at all? The world of the first century was a place on edge, a fragile balance of power held together by Rome's iron grip. Across the Mediterranean, legions marched, their standards flashing in the sun, their swords enforcing the will of an empire that stretched from Britain to the deserts of Judea. For ordinary people living under this colossal machine, Rome was both protector and oppressor. Roads, aqueducts, and trade brought prosperity, but beneath it all simmered fear, resentment, and rebellion. Nowhere was this tension more volatile than in Judea. The Jewish people lived under foreign rule, their temple watched by Roman soldiers, their culture often mocked and misunderstood by the conquerors who demanded taxes and obedience. Revolts had flared before and would flare again. Into this charged atmosphere stepped a man whose words cut sharper than any Roman blade, Jesus of Nazareth. To some, he was a prophet, to others a blasphemer. But to Rome, he was a potential threat, because any figure who could stir the hearts of the masses was a figure who could spark rebellion. We must pause here to understand the world that surrounded him. For the Romans, control was everything. They were pragmatic rulers. They tolerated many religions, many gods, but only if those beliefs did not challenge the authority of Caesar. To proclaim a kingdom of God in a land already restless with rebellion was to speak dangerous words. The phrase itself was political dynamite. A kingdom suggested a rival power, an alternative authority, a loyalty that could undermine Rome's rule. As Jesus preached in the hills of Galilee, attracting crowds, healing the sick, and speaking of justice, whispers began to spread. Could this be the one who would liberate Judea? Could this be the Messiah, not just a spiritual leader, but a savior who would throw off Rome's yoke? For the priests and elders who already walked a thin line with the empire, such talk was terrifying. Any spark could bring the legions down upon them with ruthless efficiency. It is here that we see how quickly faith and politics became inseparable. The message of love, forgiveness, and spiritual renewal was also a challenge to earthly power. A man who inspired loyalty beyond fear, who preached that even the poor and outcast held dignity before God, was dangerous in a world built on hierarchy and control. To the authorities, Jesus was more than a preacher. He was a destabilizing force, one that could unravel the fragile peace Rome had forced upon the region. But beyond the public sermons and confrontations, there was also a quieter story, one whispered in the background. If Jesus was seen as a threat by Rome, what of those closest to him? What of his family, his disciples, and the possibility, if true, that he had a bloodline? For if the man was dangerous, how much more dangerous would his descendants be? A living heir would not just represent faith, but a direct challenge to authority, carrying both the charisma of the message and the legitimacy of blood. History tells us that empires have always feared heirs more than prophets. Prophets can be silenced, their words twisted or forgotten, but a bloodline carries continuity. It carries legitimacy, the possibility of dynasties and rival thrones. If the whispers of surviving family were ever true, then Rome, and later the Church, would have had every reason to ensure those whispers remain hidden. The crucifixion itself was Rome's ultimate weapon. Public, humiliating, brutal. It was meant not only to kill but to erase hope. By placing Jesus on a cross between criminals, Rome sought to reduce him to nothing more than another failed rebel. Yet even this act did not extinguish the movement. Within years, followers spread across the empire, carrying his words farther than Rome could imagine. And with that growth came a new danger, not just a rebellion, but of an alternative history that could undermine the foundations of power. Consider the silence around his family. In the canonical Gospels, Joseph fades into obscurity, Mary remains but a background figure, and beyond brief mentions of brothers and sisters, little is said. Why the silence? Why do the earliest documents of faith emphasize his divinity but erase so much of his human lineage? Some argue it was simply theological focus. Others suggest it was deliberate, an effort to remove any suggestion that Jesus' mission might have continued through children or heirs. And yet, small hints remain. Genealogies in Matthew and Luke trace his bloodline meticulously, connecting him to David, to Abraham, to the royal ancestry of Israel. The authors clearly saw bloodlines as important. If his past was so carefully recorded, why not his future? Why not mention whether his blood continued? Unless, of course, such knowledge was considered too dangerous to preserve. Rome's shadow falls long across this story. It was not simply soldiers and governors, but an entire system that sought to control narrative as much as territory. They understood that power lies not just in swords, but in stories. To control the story of Jesus, to reduce him to a crucified rebel, or to reshape him as a purely divine figure without heirs, was to control the legacy, and the church that later emerged inherited the same instinct. To protect its authority, it would guard the narrative with the same vigilance Rome once guarded its borders. As we leave this chapter of the story, we see the pieces falling into place. A man who preached love became a symbol of rebellion. An empire that ruled through fear sought to silence him through death. But death was not enough, for whispers lingered, of disciples, of secret teachings, of a family hidden from history's gaze. The shadow of Rome stretched long, but shadows can never fully erase what lies beneath. And so the question grows darker, more insistent. If Rome feared not only the man but the possibility of his descendants, what steps might have been taken to ensure that bloodline was forgotten? As we move forward, we will uncover the figure most often erased, the woman whose role has been diminished, yet whose presence may hold the key to this entire mystery. Among the figures who walk across the stage of the Gospels, one woman's shadow lingers longer than most. Her name has been whispered in churches, sung in hymns, and maligned in sermons for nearly 2,000 years. Mary Magdalene. To some, she was a penitent sinner, the fallen woman redeemed by grace. To others, she was a faithful follower who stood when others fled, the first witness to the resurrection. But behind these competing images lies a deeper, more unsettling question. Was she something more? Was she not only disciple, but partner, perhaps even the mother of a hidden bloodline? The official narrative, repeated for centuries, tells us little of her. She came from Magdala, a small fishing town, and she is remembered most vividly for her presence at pivotal moments. Standing near the cross, weeping at the tomb, and hearing her name spoken by the risen Christ. Yet even in these fragments, there is something different about her. While others denied him or fled into the shadows, she remained. In an age when women's voices were often erased, Hayes rang clear. Why? The answer may lie not only in the canonical Gospels, but in the texts that were banished, sealed away, branded heretical. In the Gospel of Philip, found among the Nag Hammadi manuscripts in Egypt, Mary is described as a companion of Jesus. The text hints at a closeness, at gestures of affection that cause jealousy among the male disciples. In the Gospel of Mary, she is portrayed as a leader, entrusted with teachings the others could not understand. Peter, in particular, is shown bristling at her authority, unable to accept that a woman could hold such privileged knowledge. If these texts hold even a kernel of truth, then the image of Mary Magdalene changes dramatically. No longer a repentant sinner rescued from shame, she becomes a confidant, a leader, perhaps even a partner in every sense of the word. For centuries, however, this interpretation was buried beneath layers of distortion. In the 6th century, Pope Gregory the Great delivered a sermon that conflated Mary Magdalene with the unnamed sinful woman in Luke's Gospel. Overnight, her reputation was rewritten. She became the fallen one, the prostitute cleansed by Christ's mercy. This was not simply an error of interpretation. It was an act of erasure. By diminishing her role, the Church diminished the possibility of her importance. And yet, despite this, the fragments endure. Ancient communities in France and the Mediterranean carried legends of her arrival on their shores. In Provence, she is remembered as a holy woman who lived her final days in prayer, her relics venerated in grand cathedrals. Pilgrims traveled for centuries to sites associated with her. Why such devotion, if she were nothing more than a reformed sinner? What memory of her true role survived in whispers among the faithful? Consider also the symbolic weight of her presence at the resurrection. All four canonical Gospels agree. Mary Magdalene was the first to encounter the risen Christ. Not Peter, not John, not James, but Mary. In a society where women's testimony was not even legally valid in court, why would such a story survive unless it carried undeniable truth? The very scandal of it suggests authenticity and significance. If she was the first to see him alive, the first to carry the news, then she was more than a follower. She was the apostle to the apostles. Now, imagine this role expanded. If she was indeed his closest companion, perhaps even his wife, then her presence at these moments takes on new meaning. Standing at the cross was not only an act of devotion, but of love. Weeping at the tomb was not merely the grief of a disciple, but of a partner. And the resurrection encounter becomes something more intimate, the reunion of two souls bound in ways history has tried to deny. But the most dangerous possibility of all lies in the question of children. If Mary was indeed bound to Jesus as partner, then the chance of offspring cannot be dismissed. The legends of her journey to Gaul often mention her carrying not only teachings but a child. In local traditions, she arrived by boat with companions, bringing with her the seed of a hidden dynasty. These stories may sound like myth, but myth often grows around kernels of truth. Could it be that she was not simply a disciple in exile, but the protector of a bloodline? For the Church, such an idea was intolerable. To admit that Jesus had descendants would be to admit that divine authority could pass through human veins. It would place power outside the hierarchy of bishops and popes, in the hands of families and dynasties. It would mean that salvation was not solely mediated through institutions, but carried through blood itself. And so Mary was rebranded. Her voice was silenced. Her texts were burned. Her image was reshaped until she became an example of sin rather than a bearer of truth. Yet despite these efforts, Mary Magdalene refuses to disappear. Across centuries, she has inspired mystics, artists, poets, and seekers. She is the enigma at the heart of Christianity, the woman too important to erase entirely, too dangerous to acknowledge fully. She embodies both suppression and survival, both silence and revelation. And perhaps that is why she continues to haunt history. As we leave her standing in the shadows of Rome's empire and the early church, one question lingers. If she was truly the woman at the center, then the story we have inherited is incomplete. For within her presence may lie the key not only to understanding Jesus' humanity, but to uncovering the vanished bloodline itself. And so, the trail leads us onward, away from the familiar streets of Jerusalem and into the forbidden corners of Scripture, the apocryphal texts that whisper of intimacy, betrayal, and knowledge too dangerous for the world to bear. The next step in our journey will take us into those hidden Gospels, where the voices of the silent speak again, daring us to listen. The Bible, as we know it today, feels complete, bound neatly between two covers. It is presented as a totality of truth, a sacred story without gaps. Yet this sense of wholeness is an illusion. In truth, dozens of Gospels, letters, and revelations once circulated among the early followers of Christ. Some were cherished in secret communities, others condemned as heresy, and many were buried, literally, for centuries. These are the apocryphal, the hidden writings, and within their faded words we glimpse whispers of a story far stranger, far more human, than the one officially preserved. Imagine a desert cave in Egypt, sealed for almost 2,000 years. In 1945, a group of farmers digging for fertilizer stumbled upon a jar filled with ancient manuscripts, the Nag Hammadi Library. When scholars carefully unrolled the brittle papyrus, they discovered voices long silenced, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary. Each one offered glimpses into early Christianity before it was standardized, before councils and bishops shaped a single narrative. Each one carried a dangerous implication, that the story of Jesus was not one story, but many. Among these texts, Mary Magdalene's presence emerges with striking clarity. In the Gospel of Philip, she is described as the one whom Jesus loved above all others, the one he kissed often. The language, symbolic or literal, shocked even the scholars who translated it. For here was a document suggesting intimacy, preference, even partnership. The Gospel of Mary goes further still, portraying her as a teacher who comforts and corrects the male disciples after Jesus' departure. Her authority is questioned by Peter, who demands, did he really speak privately with a woman and not openly to us? Are we to turn and all listen to her? The conflict is clear. Mary carried knowledge the others did not, knowledge they found too scandalous to accept. These voices clash dramatically with the official picture. In the canonical Gospels, Mary is present but silent, a witness rather than a leader. In the Apocryphal, she speaks, she leads, she teaches, and in her voice, we hear a challenge to the hierarchy that would later dominate Christianity. For if a woman was entrusted with hidden teachings, if she was the closest to Jesus, then the authority of male disciples, and later male bishops, was shaken. The simplest solution was to erase her authority, suppress her texts, and brand them heresy. But the Apocryphal whisper more than just Mary's importance. They hint at teachings far more mystical than the ones enshrined in the canon. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus' sayings focus on inner knowledge, on discovering the divine within oneself. In the Gospel of Judas, he is portrayed not as a traitor but as the one chosen to fulfill a deeper plan. These variations show us a faith in flux, a movement alive with competing ideas. It was not the uniform religion we imagine today, but a kaleidoscope of beliefs, some radical, some unsettling. Why were these voices silenced? The answer lies in power. By the 4th century, Christianity had become not just a faith but an institution. To unify an empire under one doctrine, diversity had to be crushed. Competing gospels became a threat, not because they were false, but because they were different. And so, with councils and edicts, bishops declared them heresy. Those who clung to them were hunted, their books destroyed, their communities scattered. What survived did so by accident, hidden in jars, buried in tombs, forgotten in caves until modern times. And yet, even in fragments, the whispers remain. Consider the Gospel of Philip's enigmatic line. The companion of the Savior is Mary Magdalene. Christ loved her more than all the disciples, and used to kiss her often on the mouth. To some, this is metaphor, spiritual intimacy described in the language of love. But to others, it is evidence of a deeper relationship, one that suggests partnership, marriage, perhaps even a bloodline. The very ambiguity is what makes it dangerous. It cannot be proven, but it cannot be erased. The Church, of course, insists these texts are heretical, written too late to be trusted. And perhaps some are. Yet we must ask, if they were so unimportant, why such urgency in suppressing them? Why burn, ban, and condemn? The violence of the erasure suggests fear. Fear that these voices might undermine the carefully constructed story. Fear that they might reintroduce a Jesus who was not only divine, but human, a man with bonds of love and blood. For those who study these Apocrypha, the picture that emerges is not one of certainty but of possibility. The possibility that Mary Magdalene's role was greater than we know. The possibility that teachings hidden for centuries might alter our understanding of faith. And, most dangerous of all, the possibility that Jesus left behind more than words. He left behind a legacy written in flesh. As we leave the sands of Nag Hammadi and the Forbidden Gospels, one truth becomes clear. History is not only what survives, but what is allowed to survive. The Apocrypha remind us that our story of Jesus is curated, edited, and incomplete. They are the missing chapters of a book we thought we knew. And within their fragile lines, like whispers carried across time, lies a question the official story refuses to answer. What if the Gospels we were never meant to read hold the key to the secret bloodline? From here, our journey leads into the halls of power, where decisions were made that shaped the very core of Christianity. If the Apocrypha were the whispers, then the Council of Nicaea was the shout that silenced them. And it is there, in the clash of emperors and bishops, that the bloodline mystery takes its next turn. In the year 325 CE, the Roman Empire stood at a crossroads. For centuries, Christians had been persecuted, hunted, and forced into the shadows of society. But under Emperor Constantine, everything changed. Christianity was no longer a fragile sect. It was on the path to becoming the official faith of the empire. Yet with legitimacy came a new problem: division. Across the Mediterranean world, countless Christian communities practiced their own traditions, told their own stories of Jesus, and circulated their own gospels. To Constantine, this chaos was unacceptable. If Christianity was to bind his empire together, it needed to speak with one voice. And so, he summoned bishops from across the known world to gather in the city of Nicaea. What followed was not just a council, it was a turning point that silenced voices forever. The Council of Nicaea was not a quiet theological discussion. It was a battle, waged not only with ideas but with politics. Over 300 bishops arrived, each carrying the weight of their community's beliefs. They debated the nature of Christ. Was he fully divine, fully human, or something in between? They argued over which gospel should be considered sacred and which should be cast aside. They struggled to define, for the first time, what it actually meant to be Christian. And above all, they knew Constantine was watching. This was not only about God, it was about power. In those smoke-filled chambers, decisions were made that would alter history. The bishops confirmed a creed that declared Jesus as both fully divine and of one essence with God, a theological move that erased alternative interpretations of his humanity. But the council's influence reached beyond theology. Though it did not finalize the biblical canon in one stroke, it set the trajectory. Certain Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were elevated as authoritative. Others, especially those that gave too much prominence to figures like Mary Magdalene or Judas, were condemned as heresy. The diversity of voices that had defined early Christianity was slowly narrowed into a single official narrative. Imagine, for a moment, the power of this silence. Communities that had cherished the Gospel of Mary or the Gospel of Philip suddenly found themselves branded as heretical. Scrolls were confiscated, teachings suppressed, leaders exiled. To disagree was no longer simply to hold a different opinion. It was to defy the authority of both church and empire. What had once been a movement of scattered, passionate groups was being reshaped into a uniform institution, one that demanded obedience. It is here that the shadow of Mary Magdalene fades further. By the time of Nicaea, her apocryphal Gospels were already circulating, whispered among those who still believed she had carried Jesus' true teachings. But in the halls of power, her voice was an inconvenience. To recognize her as a leader, a confidant, or even a companion of Christ would have destabilized the hierarchy being forged. The new church needed male apostles, male bishops, male emperors. A woman at the center of the story was not just unthinkable, it was unacceptable. And so, in the great silence of Nicaea, Mary was not merely forgotten. She was erased. Her Gospels became contraband, her memory reshaped into something safer, something less threatening. Over the following centuries, she would be rewritten, not as a leader or a partner, but as a penitent sinner, a prostitute in need of redemption. The transformation was deliberate, crafted to strip her of authority. What was once a whisper of love and leadership became a cautionary tale of weakness and repentance. Yet we must not mistake silence for absence. The decisions in Nicaea did not destroy the alternative Gospels, they merely buried them. For centuries, hidden communities kept fragments alive, storing them in remote monasteries, hiding them in caves, or encoding their memory in symbols and legends. The official church may have won the battle, but the suppressed stories lingered like ghosts. They whispered of a truth that refused to die. This is why the Council of Nicaea matters so profoundly to the mystery of the Bloodline. It was not simply a theological gathering. It was the creation of an official story. By declaring some voices sacred and others heretical, the Council shaped the Jesus we think we know and buried the Jesus we were not meant to know. If Mary Magdalene was more than the church allowed, if she was a partner, a wife, or even the mother of his children, then Nicaea was a moment that possibility was deliberately erased from history. The silence that followed was not accidental. It was constructed, but silence does not last forever. Across time, cracks in the official story began to show. Legend persisted, rumors spread, and secret societies emerged that claimed to guard the hidden truths. The suppressed voices of the Apocrypha and the erased memory of Mary Magdalene found new ways to survive, encoded in art, myth, and ritual. The Council of Nicaea may have shouted the loudest, but whispers have a way of echoing through centuries. As the bishops left Nicaea, the world of Christianity had been transformed. The empire had a creed, The church had authority, and the official story of Jesus was set on its path. Yet beneath this surface order, something far more intriguing was taking shape. The hidden Gospels and the forbidden memories did not vanish. They went underground. And in that darkness, they would become the seeds of the greatest mystery of all, the survival of a bloodline that should not exist. The next step in this story takes us beyond councils and empires, into the hidden currents of the Middle Ages. For there, in the shadows of cathedrals and castles, the whispers of a holy bloodline would resurface, carried not by bishops, but by secret societies who claimed to guard a truth too dangerous to reveal. The medieval world was a place of pilgrimage and peril. From the dusty roads of Jerusalem to the great cathedrals rising in Europe, faith and fear mingled in equal measure. Into this world rode the Knights Templar, a brotherhood unlike any other. They began humbly, poor knights sworn to protect Christian pilgrims journeying to the Holy Land. But within a century, they became something far more: bankers, warriors, architects, and legends. Their white mantles marked with red crosses struck awe and dread alike. Yet beneath their martial discipline and pious vows, whispers circulated of a deeper mission, one tied not just to the Holy Sepulchre, but to secrets buried in stone and scripture. Some believed the Templars were more than knights. They were guardians of something ancient, something the Church could not control. The story begins in 1119, when 9 knights approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem. They sought permission to establish a small order dedicated to defending pilgrims. Their quarters? The Temple Mount itself, the very ground where Solomon's temple once stood, the place where Jewish tradition believed God's presence dwelt. This was no random lodging. For years, the knights occupied the ruins, tunneling beneath, searching, guarding. What exactly they found, history never records. But legends insist that their true mission was never about pilgrims. It was about recovering hidden relics, forbidden Gospels, and perhaps even genealogical records linked to Christ himself. As decades passed, the Templars grew into a power beyond reckoning. They held lands across Europe, built fortresses that rivaled kings, and established the first international banking system. Their reach extended from Scotland to Jerusalem, from the mountains of France to the deserts of Sinai. To some, they were the sword arm of Christendom. To others, they were a secretive order whose loyalty lay not with pope or king, but with something older, something unspoken. Their rituals were shrouded in mystery. Their initiation rites whispered of knowledge forbidden to ordinary Christians. And always there lingered the question, what did they find beneath the Temple Mount? Rumors multiplied. Some claimed the Templars had discovered the Ark of the Covenant, hidden for centuries. Others insisted they uncovered scrolls, lost Gospels, and genealogies that proved Jesus had left descendants. Such a revelation would have been catastrophic to the medieval church, undermining its claim to be the sole inheritor of Christ's authority. To the Church, Jesus was divine and untouchable, beyond bloodlines or earthly heirs. But if a living lineage existed, then divine authority could run through flesh and blood, a threat no pope could allow. Was this the secret the Templars guarded? Was this why they amassed such wealth, such influence, and such fear? The Templars' rise could not last forever. By the early 1300s, they had become too powerful, too wealthy, and too enigmatic. King Philip IV of France, drowning in debt to the order, decided they must be destroyed. On a chilling Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, Philip struck. At dawn, Templars across France were arrested in a coordinated sweep. They were charged not with treason against the king, but with heresy against the Church. The accusations were grotesque: spitting on the cross, worshipping a mysterious head called Baphomet, engaging in forbidden rites. Under torture, many confessed. But behind the public charges lay a quieter suspicion that the Templars possessed a knowledge that could unravel the Church's foundations. When Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, was burned at the stake in 1314, he cried out a curse against king and pope. Yet the greater mystery was what vanished with him. The Templars' vast treasure was never found. Neither were the relics or documents they were said to have discovered in Jerusalem. Some believe the order had already moved its secrets into hiding, scattering them across Europe. Others suggest they entrusted their guardianship to successor groups, the Freemasons, the Priory of Sion, or other clandestine societies. Wherever the truth lies, one fact remains: the Templars' destruction did not erase their legend. It only deepened the mystery. To this day, Churches and chapels built by the Templars are decorated with symbols that hint at hidden knowledge, roses carved alongside crosses, geometric patterns that mirror sacred mathematics, depictions of Mary Magdalene far more prominent than the official church allowed. Was this a way of encoding the forbidden truth, that she, not Peter, carried the true legacy of Christ? That her descendants walked among them, protected by sword and secrecy? If the Council of Nicaea silenced alternative voices, the Templars may have been those who rediscovered them. They were not just warriors. They were librarians of forbidden memory, keepers of dangerous truths. And though their order was shattered, the possibility remains that they passed the knowledge into the shadows, ensuring it would never fully die. The bloodline, if it existed, would not be left unguarded. The fall of the Templars left Europe haunted. Kings had claimed their lands. The Pope had denounced their name, but the people whispered still their power. In villages, legends grew of Templars escaping with secrets too great to reveal. In Scotland, exiled knights were said to have joined battles under strange banners. In France, rumors persisted that hidden vaults beneath cathedrals still held treasures unclaimed. And in every tale, the implication lingered. The Templars had not been destroyed. They had simply gone deeper underground. This is a paradox of the Templars. Their destruction was meant to silence them, but it made them immortal. They became myth, symbol, and obsession. Writers, poets, and conspirators alike returned to their name, weaving them into the great tapestry of hidden history. And at the heart of all these stories lies the same question. What secret was so dangerous an entire order had to be erased? The trail does not end with the flames of 1314. In fact, it only grows more mysterious. For after the fall of the Templars, Europe became a breeding ground for secret societies, groups that claimed to inherit not only the Templars' symbols, but their sacred duty. If a bloodline survived, hidden from the eyes of the Church, then someone had to protect it. And in the centuries to come, whispers of that guardianship would resurface, in coded manuscripts, in enigmatic paintings, and in the shadowed brotherhoods that shaped the Renaissance and beyond. The story of the bloodline now moves into an age of secrecy and symbols, where faith, art, and conspiracy intertwined. And at the center of it all, Mary Magdalene's ghost still lingered, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be rediscovered. The fall of the Templars should have ended the whispers. Their order was scattered, their leaders executed, their name cursed from the pulpits of Europe. And yet, the silence that followed was not empty. Instead, it was filled with something far stranger, symbols carved in stone, messages hidden in glass, secrets whispered through architecture. As the Templars vanished, another phenomenon emerged across Europe, the sudden rise of Gothic cathedrals. Towering spires, luminous stained glass, and cryptic carvings transformed the skyline of medieval cities. But behind the beauty of these structures, some believe, lay something more, an encrypted language, a silent defiance, and perhaps even a map pointing to the truth the Templars carried. Consider Notre Dame of Paris, Chartres, Reims, and countless others. They were not merely places of worship. They were statements in stone, colossal monuments that embodied the faith and the mysteries of their builders. The question is, who were those builders? Many records suggest that master stonemasons, heirs to the knowledge once guarded by the Templars, were central to the Gothic explosion. Their guilds, bound by oaths and rituals, encoded secrets into the very walls they raised. To the average worshipper, the carvings were holy decoration. To those initiated in the mysteries, there was something else, signs of hidden knowledge preserved in plain sight. Walk through the portals of Chartres Cathedral, and you will notice something extraordinary. Among the saints and apostles carved into the facade, there are figures that do not quite belong. Strange symbols, zodiac signs, and even depictions of the Magdalene that defy her official role as a May penitent. The labyrinth in its nave, a great spiral path carved into the stone floor, is more than a devotional aid. Some scholars see it as a map, an echo of pilgrimage routes, or even a metaphor for a hidden journey of initiation. Why, in a church dedicated to the Virgin Mary, do we find such an overwhelming presence of symbols that connect back to other, older traditions? Could it be that the builders were embedding a secret theology, one that honored the feminine, the sacred union, and perhaps the bloodline itself? The stained glass of these cathedrals add another layer of intrigue. Bathed in light, the windows tell stories of Scripture, but not always the stories we expect. In several, Mary Magdalene appears in ways that elevate her role beyond sinner, presenting her instead as beloved disciple or spiritual equal. These were dangerous depictions in an age when the Church had already cemented her identity as penitent prostitute. Yet here she was, glowing in holy light, woven into the very fabric of sacred architecture. To most, the images were invisible in their radical meaning. But to those who knew the hidden story, they were confirmation that the Magdalene's legacy endured. Even more striking are the alchemical symbols scattered across these cathedrals. Gargoyles and grotesques leer from rooftops, often dismissed as medieval superstition. But many resemble figures from esoteric traditions, guardians of hidden wisdom. Carvings of vines, roses, and chalices appear repeatedly, symbols long associated with the feminine and with blood. The rose in particular became the emblem of secrecy, giving rise to the phrase sub rosa, under the rose, meaning kept in confidence. Was it coincidence that roses bloomed in the carvings of Gothic churches at the same moment that the Magdalene story was being erased elsewhere? Or was it a silent protest, a code that said, "We remember"? The timing of the Gothic boom is itself suspicious. The great cathedrals flourished in the wake of the Templar suppression. It is as though the knowledge the knights once carried was passed in new hands, new builders, who chose to preserve it not in books that could be burned, but in stone that could not be erased. Architecture became a cipher, a vessel that could endure the centuries, silently speaking to those who knew how to listen. The Church, of course, embraced these cathedrals. To them, they were triumphs of Christian devotion, monuments to the glory of God. And indeed, they were. But what if they were also something more, a Trojan horse of faith, carrying within them the secret memory of what had been forbidden? If the bloodline of Christ survived, and if the Magdalene had been his companion, then the builders of these cathedrals may have seen themselves not just as artisans, but as guardians of that hidden truth. Over time, these whispers in stone took on a life of their own. The stonemason guilds evolved, their traditions passed down in secrecy. Centuries later, they would emerge as Freemasonry, carrying with them many of the same symbols: the compass, the square, the rose, the hidden hand of knowledge. The Gothic cathedrals, then, were not just houses of prayer. They were seeds of a secret society, one that would carry the legacy of the Templars and perhaps the bloodline itself into the modern age. Even today, visitors to these cathedrals feel something difficult to explain. Beyond the grandeur, beyond the beauty, there is a sensation of mystery, an intuition that the walls themselves are alive with secrets. To run your hand along the cool stone, to stand in the wash of colored light, is to stand within a code centuries old, a message left by builders who could not speak their truth aloud. They left it instead in geometry, in light, in symbols that outlasted kings and councils. The whispers in stone remind us that history is not only written in books. Sometimes it is carved into the very bones of our world, waiting to be read. And as the Middle Ages turned toward the Renaissance, these whispers grew louder. The hidden story of Christ and Mary Magdalene would not only live in stone, it would come alive in paint, in canvas, in brushstrokes that carried forbidden symbols into the heart of the Church itself. The next chapter of this mystery is not told in castles or cathedrals, but in art. For in the genius of the Renaissance, from the frescoes of hidden chapels to the works of masters like Leonardo da Vinci, the Magdalene would rise again, cloaked not in penance, but in beauty, power, and perhaps a secret truth too dangerous for the world to know. The Middle Ages whispered in stone, but the Renaissance shouted in color, light, and genius. It was a time when art became more than decoration. It became language, a vehicle for secrets too dangerous to write in words. In this age of rebirth, where the Church commissioned masterpieces to glorify its power, artists found subtle ways to embed forbidden messages beneath the brushstrokes. And no artist embodied this dangerous dance more than Leonardo da Vinci. Revered as a genius, inventor, and visionary, Leonardo's paintings concealed layers of symbolism that, to some, reveal a startling truth, that Mary Magdalene was never erased at all. She was simply hidden in plain sight. At first glance, Leonardo's The Last Supper seems a straightforward depiction of Jesus with his apostles. But look closer. Where tradition should show 12 men gathered around Christ, we find a figure beside him who appears strangely feminine. This figure, long assumed to be the Apostle John, has flowing hair, delicate features, and no beard. But to those who dare to question, the figure is not John at all. It is Mary Magdalene. The placement is telling. Seated at Jesus' right hand, their bodies forming a perfect V-shape, an ancient symbol of the feminine and of the womb. Some see in this composition not coincidence, but intention, a visual declaration of partnership, of sacred union. If Leonardo did indeed place the Magdalene at the table, the implications are staggering. It would mean that in one of the most iconic religious images of all time, the truth was smuggled past the watchful eyes of his patrons. The Church believed it was commissioning a devotional work to affirm its authority. But Leonardo may have been leaving behind a coded message, one that challenged the very foundations of that authority. And The Last Supper is not the only work that raises questions. Leonardo's fascination with feminine symbolism is evident across his art. Consider his depictions of the Virgin and Child, where the feminine presence is often elevated, mysterious, and central. His sketches reveal a mind obsessed with duality, the balance of opposites, male and female, light and shadow. Was this merely artistic exploration, or was it the philosophy of a man who had glimpsed hidden truths through the secret societies of his time? For Leonardo was no isolated genius. He lived in an Italy alive with clandestine brotherhoods, many of which claimed descent from the Templars, guardians of the Bloodline. It is not impossible that he inherited their symbols and chose to preserve them in his art. The Magdalene's presence in Renaissance art was not limited to Leonardo. Across Europe, painters began depicting her in ways that defied the Church's narrative. Far from the penitent sinner clothed in rags, she appears as noble, radiant, and even royal. In some works, she is dressed in red, the color of blood, of passion, of lineage. In others, she cradles a chalice, a vessel that recalls both the Eucharist and the legendary Holy Grail. Was this coincidence, or a deliberate attempt by artists to restore her to her rightful place as a companion of Christ? For centuries, the Holy Grail had been sought as a chalice, a relic of Christ's last meal. But during the Renaissance, another interpretation began to surface. What if the Grail was never a cup at all? What if it was a metaphor for the Magdalene herself, for the womb that carried the bloodline? The imagery is powerful, and it appears in painting after painting, often overlooked, yet always present. Leonardo and his contemporaries were masters of allegory, embedding messages that could be read differently by the uninitiated and the initiated. To one, a simple religious scene, to another, a revelation. But why would Leonardo take such risks? Why would he conceal Magdalene in his work, knowing that discovery could bring charges of heresy? The answer may lie in his worldview. Leonardo was a man who saw beyond dogma, who dissected corpses to understand life, who sketched machines centuries ahead of his time. To such a mind, the rigid authority of the Church must have seemed like a prison. If he believed the Magdalene's story had been erased, then art was his weapon to bring it back, not loudly, not in open defiance, but quietly, through whispers in paint that could endure across centuries. The Church never accused Leonardo of heresy, perhaps because it never noticed, or perhaps because it could not afford to. To accuse a man of such brilliance, whose works brought glory to Rome and Florence, would have drawn unwanted attention. Better, perhaps, to let the whispers remain whispers. Better to allow the Magdalene to live in the shadows of canvas than risk her rising in the hearts of the faithful. Today, standing before the Last Supper, one cannot help but feel the tension. The table is silent, yet alive with secrets. Jesus' hands are spread wide, palms open as though in offering, while beside him sits a figure whose very presence challenges a narrative. Between them, the space forms not emptiness but a vessel, a grail of flesh and spirit, a void that speaks louder than any word. It is as if Leonardo invites us to ask the question the Church has long avoided. Was Mary Magdalene more than we were told? The Renaissance gave us beauty, but it also gave us ambiguity. Its artists cloaked truth in allegory, ensuring that dangerous ideas could survive. And in that survival, the Magdalene's ghost walked again, not in scripture, but in paint, color, and geometry. She was never gone. She was waiting, her story preserved by the brushstrokes of men bold enough to hint at her truth. As the Renaissance gave way to the modern age, these hints multiplied. Secret societies grew bolder, carrying the symbols of Magdalene and the bloodline into their rituals. The Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, and later even the Illuminati, all carried echoes of the same hidden legacy. The whispers of stone became whispers of canvas, then whispers of ritual. Each age added its own layer, its own guardians. And always, the same haunting question remained. If there was a bloodline, who carried it forward. The journey now moved from the brilliance of Renaissance art into the shadows of clandestine brotherhoods. For there, in hidden lodges and candlelit rituals, the guardians of the secret would craft a network that spanned continents, shaping revolutions, nations, and perhaps even the very course of history, all while protecting the memory of a vanished bloodline. As Europe emerged from the brilliance of the Renaissance, a new force began to move quietly beneath the surface of history. The cathedrals had whispered in stone, Leonardo had painted in code, but the next guardians of the mystery chose an even subtler form of survival, brotherhood. These were not orders of knights marching beneath banners, no artists hiding truths in brushstrokes. These were men bound by ritual, oath, and secrecy, men who called themselves Freemasons. The origins of Freemasonry are cloaked in ambiguity. To the uninitiated, it began as a guild of stonemasons, craftsmen who built the Gothic cathedrals of Europe. But to those who look deeper, the story suggests something far more profound. Freemasonry, many believe, is the heir to the Templars, the continuation of their mission, their symbols, and their hidden guardianship of a secret too dangerous for the world to know. The square and compass, the apron, the rituals of initiation, all these appear ordinary on the surface, but each contains echoes of older mysteries. Some say that when the Templars were destroyed, their knowledge was not lost, it was encrypted into the traditions of the Freemasons, preserved for future generations. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Freemasonry had spread across Europe, attracting not only builders but kings, philosophers, scientists, and revolutionaries. Behind closed doors, in candlelit lodges, they performed ceremonies that traced their lineage back to Solomon's Temple, the very site once guarded by the Templars. Their symbols, the all-seeing eye, the pillars of Jachin and Boaz, the rose, the star, spoke a language of hidden truths. To the outside world, they were a fraternity devoted to moral virtue and mutual aid. But to insiders, the rituals hinted at something deeper, a continuity of knowledge, a lineage of spirit, and perhaps even a bloodline of flesh. It is here that the Magdalene returns, though her name was never openly spoken. Instead, her presence was encoded in symbols. The rose, emblem of secrecy, became central to Masonic lore. The chalice, the grail, appeared in their rituals and architecture. Even the reverence of the feminine, a rare quality in patriarchal Europe, found expression in Masonic myth. Some Masonic rites told of a sacred union, a balance of male and female, echoing the very partnership the Church had erased from its canon. To those who believed in the bloodline, the message was clear. The Magdalene's memory lived on, protected by men who swore never to reveal the full extent of their charge. The power of the Freemasons was not limited to ritual. They influenced revolutions. In France, Masonic lodges became breeding grounds for ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity, concepts that undermined the authority of kings and popes alike. In America, many of the founding fathers were Freemasons, their architecture and symbols woven into the very design of the new republic. The Great Seal of the United States, with its unfinished pyramid and all-seeing eye, is to some a testament to the secret hand of the Brotherhood. Was it coincidence that nations born in defiance of monarchy and papal control were shaped by men tied to a society that may have carried a hidden legacy of the Templars and the Magdalene? Yet secrecy breeds suspicion. The Freemasons were accused of everything from devil worship to world domination. In truth, much of their activity was philosophical and charitable. But beneath the surface, one cannot ignore the persistence of symbols tied to the bloodline. Why did Masonic lodges place such emphasis on the Temple of Solomon, the very place where the Templars supposedly unearthed their great secret? Why did their rituals mirror not only medieval traditions, but also Gnostic ideas long condemned by the Church? And why did whispers of a hidden royal secret follow them wherever they went? Some historians argue that the royal secret was not political power, but genealogical truth, the survival of a holy bloodline that undermined the Church's monopoly on spiritual authority. If Christ had descendants, if Mary Magdalene was a true bearer of his legacy, then divine kingship did not belong to Rome. It flowed in human veins. Protecting such a truth required discretion, for to reveal it openly would mean annihilation. And so, through symbols, rituals, and allegories, the Freemasons preserved what could not be spoken. Of course, not all Masons knew the secret. Like any great brotherhood, knowledge was tiered, guarded, revealed only to those deemed worthy. The outer circles spoke of morality and virtue. The inner circles whispered of mysteries too dangerous for daylight. The Magdalene, if present in their lore, was hidden in allegory, but allegory has a way of surviving. It lingers in architecture, in ritual, in the very culture of the lodge. Even today, Masonic symbols are everywhere, woven into the fabric of our cities. Cornerstones of government buildings bear the marks of the compass and square. Statues of liberty, justice, and wisdom stand with veiled references to ancient goddesses and sacred unions. In plain sight, the Magdalene's legacy may live still, coded not in scripture or fresco, but in the language of stone and symbol, carried forward by men who claim to serve truth above dogma. The question that lingers is not whether Freemasonry preserved a mystery, it is what that mystery was. Was it merely philosophy disguised in ritual? Or was it something far more incendiary, the knowledge that the bloodline of Christ survived, and that it lived on not in Rome cathedrals, but in the veins of hidden heirs, protected across centuries by oaths, symbols, and brotherhood? As the age of enlightenment dawned, these secret societies grew bolder, their influence reaching into revolutions and republics. Yet even as their light shone on the world stage, there remained shadows at the edges of history, whispering of truths never fully revealed. If the Magdalene's bloodline endured, then the Freemasons may not have been its final guardians. For soon, another brotherhood would rise, one even more enigmatic, weaving its identity into myth, legend, and conspiracy. The next chapter belongs to the Priory of Sion, a name that would echo across centuries as the supposed keepers of the most dangerous secret in history, the blood of Christ, hidden not in chalices of gold, but in the flesh of his descendants. In the shadowed corridors of European history, there exists a name that seems to whisper rather than shout, a name that emerges briefly, only to vanish again into obscurity. The Priory of Sion. To most, it is nothing more than a footnote, a half-forgotten brotherhood mentioned in passing. But to those who dig deeper, it becomes something altogether different, a secret society tied to ancient bloodlines, sacred mysteries, and perhaps the most dangerous truth of all, that the story of Jesus did not end on the cross. The origins of the Priory are as elusive as mist at dawn. Some trace its founding to 1099, in the wake of the First Crusade, when Godfrey of Bouillon, one of the leaders who captured Jerusalem, allegedly established a brotherhood dedicated to preserving a great and hidden truth. Others argue that the Priory is older still, stretching back to Merovingian Gaul, the dynasty of long-haired kings who claimed descent not from Rome, but from a more sacred source. According to these legends, the Priory was not merely a band of knights or monks, but the secret custodians of a bloodline, an unbroken lineage linking the Magdalene and her children to the thrones of Europe. At first glance, this seems nothing more than romantic myth, but history offers tantalizing fragments. The Merovingian kings of France were unlike their contemporaries. They styled themselves not only as rulers, but as sacred monarchs, chosen by divine right. Their long, flowing hair was said to symbolize their holy essence. Their enemies feared them not for their armies alone, but for the aura of sanctity that clung to their reign. Could it be that the Merovingians were seen as divine because they carried within their veins the blood of Christ himself? And if so, who ensured that such a truth survived in secret? Here the Priory of Sion enters like a shadow. Unlike the Templars, who wielded swords, or the Freemasons, who built lodges, the Priory moved in silence, through genealogy, influence, and whispered alliances. Their supposed task was not conquest, but protection. They guarded documents, relics, and perhaps even individuals who carried the sacred lineage. Their very existence was a form of defiance against the Church, for if Christ's bloodline endured, then the papacy's claim to divine authority crumbled. The true heirs of the faith were not seated in Rome, but hidden in plain sight across Europe. For centuries, little was heard of the Priory. Then, in the 20th century, a shocking series of documents surfaced in France. The dossier secrets, discovered in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. These papers outline the genealogy of the Merovingian line, detailed the supposed role of the Priory of Sion, and even listed a Grand Mastership that included names of extraordinary influence, artists, scientists, and visionaries. Among them, Leonardo da Vinci, Isaac Newton, Victor Hugo. Could it be that these towering figures of history were not only geniuses but secret guardians of a hidden truth? The implications were staggering. If Da Vinci had indeed been a grand master, then his cryptic symbolism in works like The Last Supper and The Vitruvian Man took on a new weight. If Newton, the man who uncovered the laws of motion, had carried the priory's secrets, then perhaps his obsession with biblical prophecy was not madness, but coded guardianship. And if Hugo, the author of Les Miserables, was part of the chain, then literature itself became a vessel of secrecy. Skeptics argue that the priory was nothing more than a 20th century hoax, fabricated by Pierre Planted, a Frenchman who sought to elevate his own lineage by connecting it to the Merovingians. Yet even if some documents were embellished, the myth refuses to die. Why? Because too many fragments align with older whispers, too many connections stretch across centuries to dismiss entirely. Planted may have forged papers, but did he also forge the centuries of symbolism, legends, and encoded traditions that preceded him? The fascination with the priory lies not only in what it may have hidden, but in how it may have operated. Unlike other secret societies, the priory did not seek to dominate openly. Its influence, if real, was subtle, shaping dynasties, guiding ideas, protecting individuals. It was, in essence, the unseen hand of history. And in its care, if the legends are true, lay the descendants of Christ and Magdalene themselves, the true Holy Grail. What makes a priory so compelling is the possibility that it still exists. Unlike the Templars, who were destroyed in fire and torture, or the Freemasons, whose lodges are known invisible, the priory remains a ghost. If it lives, it does so in shadows. Its members are unknown, its actions invisible, its purpose cloaked in mystery. Perhaps it no longer guards relics but bloodlines, ensuring that the descendants of a sacred union remain alive, protected, and hidden from the grasp of those who would exploit or destroy them. If this is true, then history itself has been manipulated not by chance, but by guardians. Wars, marriages, revolutions, each may have been influenced by a hidden goal, the preservation of a bloodline that, if revealed, could alter the foundation of Western faith and power. Imagine the scandal if the Church's greatest secret emerged, that Christ had not been celibate, had not been alone, but had left behind heirs whose descendants walked the earth still. Such a revelation would not merely shake theology, it would reshape civilization itself. The Priory of Sion represents that possibility. Whether real or myth, its shadow continues to haunt the imagination. Was it truly founded by Godfrey of Bouillon in Jerusalem, its mission encoded in stone and secrecy? Or was it a modern invention that accidentally touched upon older truths? Perhaps the answer lies not in archives or documents, but in blood itself, in the DNA of families who, knowingly or not, may carry within them the most explosive legacy in human history. The Priory's story leads us inevitably to the present. For if the guardian survived, if the lineage endures, then who are its heirs today? Are they nameless men and women, living quietly in Europe, unaware of their ancestry? Or are they watched, protected, prepared for a time when the secret must be revealed? The next stage of this journey will take us into modern times, where whispers of the bloodline became louder, where popular culture, conspiracy, and scholarship collided. For in the 20th and 21st centuries, the Magdalene's legacy would no longer remain in shadow. It would explode into global consciousness, reshaping not only belief, but imagination. In the rolling hills and sun-drenched valleys of southern France, history lingers like a perfume, faint yet undeniable. It is here, in the ancient region of Languedoc, that whispers of the Magdalene grow loudest. Far from Rome's authority, this land has long been a cradle of heresy, mystery, and rumor. To the casual traveler, it is a place of vineyards and castles. But to those who know its legends, it is sacred ground, haunted by the possibility that beneath its soil lies the greatest secret of all, the lost tombs of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. The story begins in the medieval town of Rennes-le-Château, perched high on a hill, overlooking the countryside. In the late 19th century, a parish priest named Bérenger Saunier undertook renovations on his crumbling church. What he discovered would ignite one of the most enduring mysteries in modern history. Saunier suddenly grew immensely wealthy, far beyond the means of a rural clergyman. He built extravagant structures, hosted lavish gatherings, and left behind cryptic symbols etched into the very stones of his church. Where had his fortune come from? Some say he stumbled upon hidden documents or relics, clues that tied his small parish to the bloodline of Christ. The mystery of Rennes-le-Château has never been solved, but its connection to the Magdalene runs deep. Local folklore has long claimed that Mary Magdalene came to southern France after the crucifixion, fleeing persecution in the Holy Land. According to legend, she arrived by boat with her companions, carrying with her either sacred relics or children. In Provence, chapels dedicated to her dot the landscape. Caves bear her name, said to be the places where she prayed and wept. The people of the region have for centuries whispered that she lived out her final days here, buried in secret, her legacy guarded by those who knew the truth. But it is not only folklore that fuels the story. Archaeological fragments, strange inscriptions, and coded symbols scatter the landscape. Some graves in the area display unusual markings, crosses entwined with roses, chalices carved into stone, imagery that speaks not of Orthodox Catholicism but of something older, something hidden. The Cathars, a medieval sect condemned as heretics by the Church, also flourished here. They spoke of a true Christianity that Rome had suppressed, a faith rooted not in power but in spiritual equality. Many believe that the Cathars inherited the Magdalene secret, and that their extermination in the 13th century was not only about heresy, but about silencing knowledge of the bloodline. The siege of Montségur in 1244, where hundreds of Cathars perished in flames, is often remembered as an act of brutality. But some legends insist that, before their fortress fell, a group of Cathar knights slipped away with a great treasure. Was it gold? Or was it a relic? Perhaps even documents revealing the Magdalene's lineage? Some whisper it was a grail itself, not a chalice of stone, but a bloodline of flesh. If true, then somewhere in the hills and valleys of southern France, the evidence of that secret may still lie hidden. Modern researchers have been drawn to this mystery like moths to flame. Explorers have combed the landscape, seeking hidden crypts, sealed caves, and forgotten chapels. Some claim to have uncovered tunnels beneath Rennes Chateau, though access is tightly controlled. Others have studied maps and found patterns, alignments of sacred sites forming geometric shapes that seem too precise to be chance. The landscape itself appears to hold a code, as if the very hills were arranged to point toward a hidden tomb. Perhaps the most compelling clue lies in the region's devotion to the Magdalene. Unlike in Rome, where her image was suppressed or distorted, here she is revered openly. Churches bear her name. Statues depict her not as a fallen woman, but as a saint, a figure of wisdom, even a mother. Pilgrims still visit her supposed grotto at St. Baume, climbing the rocky path where, according to tradition, she spent her final years in prayer. The reverence is palpable, as if the people of Provence have always known that her story did not end in Jerusalem. But if tombs exist, if the bodies of Magdalene or even Jesus himself were brought to France, why have they not been found? Some say they were deliberately hidden, sealed away in caverns only accessible to those with secret knowledge. Others argue that the tombs have been discovered, but the truth suppressed by the Church, just as it suppressed the Gnostic Gospels. After all, the revelation of a physical tomb containing Jesus' remains would shatter the cornerstone of Christian belief, the resurrection. And if Magdalene's remains were found, accompanied by evidence of children, the narrative of celibacy and purity so carefully built by Rome would collapse. There are those who insist that Saunier, the mysterious priest, stumbled upon precisely such evidence. His sudden wealth, his cryptic inscriptions, his obsession with Magdalene imagery in his church, all suggest he uncovered something explosive. Some say he was paid to remain silent. Others believe he struck a bargain with the Church, using the discovery as leverage. Whatever the truth, he took it to his grave, leaving behind a puzzle that has obsessed generations of seekers. Even today, treasure hunters scour the area. Some claim to have found ancient manuscripts. Others swear they've seen sealed tombs guarded by authorities. Yet no conclusive proof has emerged. The mystery remains suspended, tantalizing, just out of reach. Perhaps that is fitting, for secrets of this magnitude are not meant to be uncovered easily. They resist exposure, surviving only in fragments, folklore, symbols, and whispers carried by the wind through the vineyards and hills. What is certain is this. Southern France holds a peculiar magnetism, a sense that something profound lies buried beneath its soil. Whether legend or truth, the belief in the Magdalene's presence here has endured for nearly 2 millennia. It is as though the land itself remembers, carrying in its stones and rivers the memory of a woman who may have carried within her not only the message of Christ, but his very bloodline. The search for the lost tombs continues. But the deeper one digs, the more one realizes that the mystery is not only about bones or relics. It is about what those bones would mean. To uncover them would be to rewrite history, to dethrone institutions, to redefine faith. And so, whether they remain hidden by chance or by design, the lost tombs of southern France may forever stand as both the greatest treasure and the greatest threat in Christian history. The trail from Provence and Rennes-le-Château leads us next to modern scholarship and discovery, moments when fragments of this buried truth seem to break through into public awareness, forcing us to question how much of the Magdalene story has been deliberately concealed and how much is still waiting to be revealed. The story of the Magdalene and the hidden bloodline might have remained locked in folklore and legend, confined to the whispers of southern France and the coded rituals of secret brotherhoods. But the modern world, with its relentless pursuit of evidence, has reopened the case. The 20th and 21st centuries have uncovered fragments, ancient scrolls, long-lost texts, archaeological finds, and even genetic clues that breathe fresh life into the possibility that the story we are being told for centuries is not the whole truth. It began in 1945 in the Egyptian desert near Nag Hammadi. A local farmer, digging for fertilizer, stumbled upon a sealed jar. Inside lay a collection of ancient manuscripts that would shake biblical scholarship. These texts, known as the Nag Hammadi Library, were Gnostic writings, many of them long thought destroyed by the early church. Among them were Gospels that painted a very different picture of early Christianity. One in particular, the Gospel of Philip, suggested a closeness between Jesus and Mary Magdalene so profound that it could not be ignored. It described her as a companion of the Savior, the disciple he loved more than all others. It even hinted at an intimate bond, stating that Jesus often kissed her on the mouth. For the Church, such implications were scandalous. For seekers, they were confirmation that the Magdalene's role had been deliberately diminished. A few decades later, another text emerged, the Gospel of Mary, discovered in fragments in Cairo. Here, Magdalene is depicted not as a repentant sinner, but as a disciple who truly understood Christ's message, a teacher in her own right, entrusted with visions of the risen Lord. In this gospel, Peter grows jealous of her authority, reflecting the very power struggle that may have defined the birth of the institutional church. If Magdalene was indeed the chosen successor, then the foundation of Christianity as we know it rests not on Peter's primacy, but on her suppressed leadership. But texts were only the beginning. Archaeological discoveries added fuel to the fire. In 1980, a construction crew in Tol Piot, near Jerusalem, uncovered a tomb containing ossuaries, limestone bone boxes, marked with inscriptions. Among the names inscribed were Yeshua bar Yosef, Jesus son of Joseph, Maria, Yos, and Miriamne. To some, this was evidence of the family of Jesus. The ossuary inscribed Miriamne, also called Mara, has been linked by some scholars to Mary Magdalene. If true, then the Tol Piot tomb may have held the remains of Jesus and his family, a revelation that, if confirmed, would fundamentally contradict the doctrine of resurrection and celibacy. The discovery remains controversial. The Church dismissed it. Many scholars remain skeptical, yet the questions linger. Why would a cluster of names so closely tied to the New Testament appear in a single tomb? Was it coincidence, or the physical proof of a family buried in secrecy? The bones themselves were long removed, leaving DNA testing inconclusive. Still, the Tol Piot tomb remains one of the most tantalizing archaeological puzzles of the modern age. At the same time, science has turned its lens toward genetics. Advances in DNA analysis have opened doors unimaginable to earlier generations. Projects mapping the genetic histories of European populations have revealed curious anomalies, traces of lineages that cannot easily be explained by known migrations. Some theorists suggest these could be remnants of Near Eastern bloodlines that entered Europe in antiquity, perhaps through precisely the kind of hidden descendants the Magdalene legend describes. It is speculative, yes, but in the age of genetic genealogy, the possibility of tracing such a lineage has moved from myth to science. Even the Shroud of Turin, that enigmatic relic, has entered the debate. Carbon dating in the 1980s dismissed it as medieval, but later studies have raised doubts about those results, pointing to contamination and selective sampling. More recent analyses have suggested the cloth contained pollen from plants native to the Jerusalem area, and even traces of DNA from multiple individuals. Could it be that the shroud, if authentic, carries genetic material not only from Christ himself but from those who handled and preserved it? Some propose that, one day, genetic testing might reveal connections between relics, ossuaries, and even living descendants. The modern discoveries have done more than offer tantalizing clues. They have ignited imagination on a global scale. In the mid-20th century, scholars such as Hugh Schonfield published works like The Passover Plot, suggesting that Jesus' story was not miraculous legend but calculated plan. Others, like Margaret Starbird, argue that the Magdalene was bride, mother, and vessel of the sacred bloodline. Their ideas might have remained on the fringes of scholarship, were it not for the cultural explosion that followed. Popular culture seized upon these discoveries and theories, weaving them into novels, films, and documentaries. Suddenly, the Magdalene was no longer a footnote. She was a heroine, a bearer of truth, a figure whose role had been stolen by patriarchal authority. What had been academic debate became cultural phenomenon. And with each wave of interest, more eyes turned toward the scrolls, the tombs, the relics, the DNA. The line between scholarship and conspiracy blurred, but one truth remained. People wanted to know what the church had hidden. The quest for evidence continues. Geneticists, archaeologists, and theologians debate fiercely, often at odds, sometimes at risk to their careers. The church holds its ground, dismissing alternative narratives as fanciful or heretical. But the discoveries, once unearthed, cannot be buried again. They live on in the public imagination, demanding answers to questions once thought impossible to ask. Did Jesus leave behind children? Did Magdalene carry his bloodline to France? And if so, what proof might remain, waiting to be uncovered by science? The modern discoveries do not give us certainty, but they shift the conversation. Where once the Magdalene story was dismissed as myth, now it stands at the intersection of history, archaeology, and science. The scrolls reveal her importance, the tombs hint at her presence, and the DNA offers a new frontier for exploration. Each discovery, fragmentary though it may be, forms part of a larger mosaic, one that suggests the greatest secret of Christianity may have survived in silence, waiting for the modern world to listen. The stage is now set for the next chapter, when these threads, myth, evidence, and speculation burst into the mainstream, carried not by scholars or priests, but by popular writers and filmmakers. For in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the Magdalene's bloodline would leap from hidden manuscripts and sealed tombs into the heart of global culture, sparking both fascination and fury. The Magdalene story, once confined to obscure manuscripts, dusty libraries, and whispered legends in southern France, exploded into the modern consciousness in the early 2000s. It did not emerge through a discovery in an archaeological dig or a proclamation from a cathedral pulpit, but through a novel, a work of fiction that shook the world like an earthquake. That novel was Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. Published in 2003, the book sold tens of millions of copies almost overnight, sparking debates in churches, universities, and living rooms around the globe. For countless readers, it was their first encounter with the idea that Mary Magdalene was not a prostitute, not a marginal figure, but the wife of Jesus and the mother of his child. In Brown's narrative, she was a holy grail, not a chalice of stone, but a vessel of blood, the bearer of Christ's lineage. And behind her story stood secret brotherhoods like the Priory of Sion and the Freemasons, guarding the truth for centuries against a church determined to erase it. The novel was fiction, of course, but it was built on a foundation of scholarship, speculation, and legend that had been building for decades. Books like Holy Blood, Holy Grail by Bygent, Lee, and Lincoln had already raised the possibility of a bloodline, linking it to the Merovingians and secret societies. Yet the Da Vinci Code made the theory accessible, thrilling, and dangerously popular. Suddenly, what had been the realm of historians and fringe researchers became dinner-table conversation. The reaction was immediate and fierce. The Catholic Church denounced the book as heretical, accusing it of misleading the faithful and distorting history. Scholars debated its claims, some dismissing it outright, others acknowledging that while the story was embellished, it pointed to genuine historical controversies, suppressed gospels, ambiguous relics, coded art. Tourists flooded Paris to gaze at the Louvre's paintings through new eyes, seeking hidden messages in the Last Supper and the Mona Lisa. Pilgrims returned to Rennes Chateau, convinced that Sonia's fortune and secrets had been tied to the Magdalene. What had once been the obsession of a few became a global phenomenon. But why did it resonate so powerfully? Perhaps because the story offered something deeply human. The idea that Jesus, the most divine figure in Western history, had lived as a man, that he had loved, married, and fathered children, This vision made him accessible, relatable, not a remote, untouchable figure, but someone who experienced the joys and struggles of family. For many, this was not a diminishment of Christ's divinity, but an affirmation of his humanity. It reframed faith not as obedience to a distant institution, but a connection to a living legacy. The novel also struck a chord with those disillusioned by patriarchal religion. For centuries, the church had diminished women, relegating them to silence or servitude. Yet here was a story in which a woman stood at the very heart of the Christian mystery. Mary Magdalene was not the fallen sinner of papal invention. She was the apostle to the apostles, the partner of the Messiah, the true Holy Grail. In her, readers saw the possibility of a more balanced, inclusive spirituality, one in which the feminine was not erased but revered. Hollywood amplified the effect. The 2006 film adaptation, starring Tom Hanks and Audrey Tautou, brought the narrative to an even wider audience. Though critics panned it, audiences flocked to theaters. The imagery of secret societies, coded art, and whispered bloodlines burned itself into the global imagination. For millions, the Magdalene was no longer a figure of shame. She was a symbol of mystery, power, and hidden truth. Of course, the backlash was inevitable. The Vatican issued statements, theologians wrote rebuttals, and historians pointed out the liberties Brown had taken. Yet the very intensity of the response only deepened the intrigue. After all, why should the church react so strongly to a novel if there were truly nothing to hide? The denials, the outrage, the attempts to silence discussion, these only fueled the suspicion that the Magdalene's secret was more than fantasy. The Da Vinci Code effect was not confined to one book or one movie. It opened the floodgates for a wave of documentaries, debates, and further novels. TV networks aired specials on Rennes Chateau, the Templars, and the Priory of Sion. Scholars re-examined the Gnostic Gospels. Even mainstream outlets began to ask questions about the role of Magdalene in early Christianity. The novel may have been fiction, but it reignited a global conversation about history, faith, and secrecy. For some, it was liberating. For others, it was dangerous. But no one could deny its impact. It made the Magdalene visible again after centuries of silence, and it placed the possibility of Christ's bloodline at the center of cultural imagination. Whether one believed it or not, the idea could no longer be dismissed as obscure conspiracy. It had entered the mainstream, where it continues to resonate to this day. But the Da Vinci Code did something even more profound. It blurred the line between myth and history, between story and truth. Readers left its pages asking, what if Magdalene was more than we were told? What if Christ's bloodline survived? What if the church has spent 2,000 years guarding a lie? These questions lingered, unsettling, impossible to ignore. And yet, fiction can only carry us so far. Beyond novels and films, real history still waits, buried in texts, in relics, in the living blood of descendants. If the Magdalene story is true, then somewhere, hidden in plain sight, the heirs of Christ walk among us still. The next step is to ask, who are they, and how has their presence shaped history? For now, though, we leave the world of fiction and return to the realm of fact, or at least to the tantalizing fragments of it. Because the question that the Da Vinci Code placed before the world has not been answered, only magnified. And to seek that answer, we must follow the trail into the labyrinth of modern conspiracies, where whispers of bloodlines mingle with politics, power, and the possibility that the greatest secret of all has already touched our world in ways we cannot imagine. If the Magdalene truly carried with her a child of Jesus, and if that bloodline survived beyond the first century, where did it go? This is a question that lingers like a shadow behind the legends, and it is here that history and myth entwine most tightly. For centuries, whispers have persisted of families scattered across Europe, some noble, some obscure, who guarded a secret legacy in silence. These were the hidden heirs, the descendants of a lineage too dangerous to reveal openly, yet too sacred to abandon. The legend most often points to Gaul, modern-day France, where Mary Magdalene is said to have landed after fleeing persecution in Palestine. Southern France, particularly the region of Provence, became steeped in her memory. Churches and shrines rose in her honor, towns claimed her relics, and folk tradition spoke of her presence. It is here, in this fertile land, that the idea of a surviving bloodline takes root. The suggestion is that Magdalene, along with Joseph of Arimathea and a circle of followers, carried not only the faith but also the family of Christ into exile. From Provence, the narrative stretches outward into the fabric of European nobility. The most tantalizing theory links this hidden bloodline to the Merovingians, the ruling dynasty of the Franks from the 5th to the 8th centuries. The Merovingians were seen as semi-mythical even in their own time. Warrior kings with supposed supernatural powers, said to be descended from a sea creature who intermarried with their ancestors. Yet beneath this mythology lies another possibility, that their power derived from a sacred lineage, passed down through generations, reaching back to the blood of Christ himself. This theory, popularized in works like Holy Blood, Holy Grail, suggests that secret guardian protected the lineage for centuries, hiding it among noble houses while carefully weaving its influence into the politics of Europe. It is said that marriages, alliances, and wars were not merely struggles for territory, but veiled moves in a larger game, the survival and positioning of Christ's descendants on the chessboard of history. To those who believe in this hidden bloodline, the monarchies of France, the rise of the Carolingians, even the Crusades, are not random events but ripples of a deeper truth. But the idea of hidden families goes beyond the Merovingians. Some point to other dynasties, scattered in Spain, Portugal, and Scotland, claiming they carried fragments of the bloodline in exile. In Portugal, the House of Avis has been whispered to carry a sacred heritage. In Scotland, the legend of the Sinclair family, tied to the Knights Templar and Rosslyn Chapel, has long been associated with the Grail mysteries. These families, the story goes, lived double lives, outwardly as nobles, warriors, or patrons of the church, but inwardly as custodians of a secret identity. The exile of these bloodlines was not only geographical but spiritual. If the Church of Rome built itself upon the narrative of Peter and Paul, then Christ's family became an inconvenient rival. Their very existence threatened the authority of popes and bishops who ruled in his name. To acknowledge a living heir would have undermined the Church's monopoly on divine power. So, the story tells us these families were forced underground, sometimes protected by sympathetic knights, sometimes persecuted into obscurity. Their silence was survival, and yet every so often their presence flickers into view. A peculiar coat of arms, a marriage alliance that seems more symbolic than strategic, or a family legend that refuses to die. Some researchers have tracked genealogical lines that appear to converge suspiciously often with places tied to Magdalene's cult. Others see in the Cathars, those medieval heretics of southern France who revered a female principle in their theology, echoes of the Magdalene tradition, perhaps influenced by bloodline families who preserved an alternative gospel. Skeptics dismiss these claims as romantic fantasy, convenient retrofitting of history into myth. They argue that noble houses are always surrounded by legends of divine descent. It was a way to legitimize power in a world where rule was sanctified by heaven. Yet even skeptics must admit the persistence of these tales is unusual. From the medieval troubadours who sang of hidden grails and sacred lovers, to the whispered rumors surrounding dynasties that vanish mysteriously, the motif of a hidden family reappears too often to be ignored. Perhaps the truth lies not in one family line, but in many. If Magdalene did carry Christ's child, then over centuries, through marriages and dispersals, that blood would have mingled into countless lineages. The idea of a single, unbroken royal line may be fantasy, but the possibility of Christ's blood still flowing through the veins of many today remains. Not in kings and queens alone, but in ordinary people, unknown heirs whose ancestry connects them unknowingly to the most contested legacy of all. What makes this theory so powerful is its implication, that history itself has been shaped not only by ideas and armies, but by the quiet survival of a secret family. That behind the thrones, councils, and wars, an invisible thread runs, a thread of blood, stretching back to a carpenter's son and the woman who may have been his wife. But this idea of exile, of hidden heirs living among us, raises the next question. If these families existed, who protected them? Who ensured their survival when the church hunted them, when dynasties fell, when wars ravaged Europe? The answer, according to legend, lies with the secret orders, the guardians of the Grail, the silent brotherhoods who swore to shield the bloodline across centuries. Their presence changes everything, for it suggests that the story of the vanished bloodline was never passive, but orchestrated, defended, and concealed by powers we are only beginning to glimpse. If Christ's bloodline survived, scattered among noble houses and exiled families, then surely they could not have endured alone. In a Europe dominated by the Catholic Church, an institution with eyes in every village and hands in every throne, the survival of such a lineage would have required guardianship. And so, legend insists there were protectors, secret societies, brotherhoods, and orders that wove themselves into the very fabric of history, existing not for wealth or glory, but to preserve the most dangerous truth of all. The first and most famous of these guardians are the Knights Templar. Born in the 12th century as a humble order of warrior monks, their official duty was to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. But soon, they became something far more powerful: financiers, builders, and holders of mysteries. Their sudden rise to immense wealth and influence has long puzzled historians. Where did they acquire their fortune? What secrets did they stumble upon during their years stationed in Jerusalem, digging beneath the ruins of the Temple of Solomon? Whispers suggest that the Templars uncovered relics not meant to be seen, perhaps documents proving Magdalene's role, perhaps evidence of Christ's bloodline, perhaps even descendants themselves. If so, their mission was never just about defending pilgrims. It was about defending a legacy, keeping alive the truth that the Church feared most. The red cross on their mantles may not have been merely a symbol of crusade, but a hidden mark of guardianship. Their fate, of course, was tragic. In 1307, the order was brutally suppressed by King Philip IV of France, who accused them of heresy and treason. Yet many believe the suppression did not end the Templar story. It only drove it underground. Some escaped to Scotland, some merged into other societies, and some carried their secrets across Europe. Their hidden treasure, whether gold or knowledge, was never found. To this day, many believe that what they truly safeguarded was a grail, not a cup, but a bloodline. But the Templars were not the only guardians whispered about in history. There's also the enigmatic Priory of Sion. Allegedly founded in 1099, this shadowy order has been tied to protection of Christ's descendants for centuries. Unlike the militaristic Templars, the Priory is said to have operated in silence, hidden in plain sight. Its Grand Masters were rumored to be some of the greatest minds of Europe, Leonardo da Vinci, Isaac Newton, and Victor Hugo among them. Whether these claims are true or fabrication, the legend of the Priory reinforces a notion that guardianship of the bloodline was not confined to swords and shields, but to intellect, art, and code. The Priory's supposed role was to ensure that the bloodline survived, even if the world was not ready to know it. To some, their work was subtle, commissioning art that carried veiled symbols, planting clues in cathedrals and chapels, encoding truth within myth. To others, they were players in a great chess game, maneuvering dynasties, influencing politics, and waiting for the day when revelation would come. Whether myth or reality, their name alone has become synonymous with secrecy. Other societies, too, have been linked with this mission. The Rosicrucians of the 17th century, with their mysterious manifestos and secret philosophies, claimed to possess hidden wisdom passed down from the ancient world. Could this have been part of the same legacy? The Freemasons, rising in the centuries after the Templars, inherited much of their symbolism, including architecture, sacred geometry, and cryptic rituals. Many have wondered if within their ranks lies a faint echo of the Templar mission, disguised, diluted, but still alive. Guardianship, however, was not always about organizations. In some cases, protection may have been carried by individuals, families sworn to secrecy, or even local traditions. Folk tales in the Languedoc region of France speak of villagers who knew something about the Magdalene, yet never spoke of it openly. In Scotland, the Sinclairs of Rosslyn Chapel are said to have preserved cryptic symbols in their churches' carvings, hints of a hidden lineage. These localized guardians kept their secrets not in the form of armies or lodges, but in whispers, stone, and story. But why would such groups or individuals risk their lives for this mission? Why devote centuries of effort to a secret so perilous? The answer, perhaps, lies in the perceived importance of the truth. If Jesus had fathered a child, and if his descendants lived, then the core church authority, that salvation came only through the institution, would crumble. For the guardians, protecting the bloodline were protecting a higher truth, that divinity was not locked in cathedrals but carried within human veins. That faith was not about submission to Rome, but about direct connection to a living, breathing heritage. This belief gave them purpose, but it also made them enemies. The Church saw heresy everywhere, hunting down the Cathars, burning the Templars, silencing any whisper of alternative gospels. To be a guardian was to walk in shadows, to trust secrecy over proclamation, to play a game of survival across generations. And yet, despite persecutions, betrayals, and purges, the legend insists the guardians endured. They adapted, changed names, shifted forms. From Templars to Masons, from priory to philosophers, from troubadours to artists, the same mission passed like a flame from one torchbearer to the next. Each generation carried the hope that one day, when humanity was ready, the truth would be revealed. For now, however, that truth remains buried in symbols, documents, and whispered genealogies. The Guardian protected not just the bloodline, but the evidence of its existence, scrolls, relics, coded art that might one day prove it beyond doubt. But guardianship implies opposition, for where there are protectors, there must be hunters. If secret societies labored to preserve the bloodline, then the church labored just as fiercely to extinguish it. The stage is set not just for a tale of secrecy, but for a centuries-long war, an invisible struggle between those who sought to shield Christ's legacy and those who sought to erase it forever. If whispers of Christ's bloodline stirred in hidden valleys and echoed in secret societies, then it is no surprise that Rome, the seat of the Catholic Church, sought to silence them with iron resolve. For the Church, the idea that Jesus left behind a wife and children was not simply heretical, it was catastrophic. It undermined everything: the authority of the papacy, the sanctity of celibacy, the notion of Christ as divine being untouched by earthly bonds. In short, it threatened the very foundation upon which the Church had built its empire. From its earliest days, the Church had carefully curated its narrative. It selected which Gospels would become canon, and which would be banished to the shadows. The Gnostic texts that spoke of Mary Magdalene as the apostle to the apostles were buried, their readers condemned as heretics. Peter and Paul became the pillars of orthodoxy, while Magdalene was recast as a repentant sinner. The erasure was deliberate. If she were remembered as Christ's closest companion, or worse, his wife, the Church's claim to authority through Peter would fracture. But the whispers did not die. In southern France, the Catholics preached a vision of Christianity that defied Rome's control, revering a feminine principle and rejecting the corruption of the established Church. To Rome, they were not merely heretics, they were threats. And so, in the 13th century, Pope Innocent III unleashed the Albigensian Crusade, a brutal campaign that wiped out entire towns in the Languedoc region. Officially, the goal was to destroy heresy. Yet many historians believe the Catholics may have held traditions linked to Magdalene, perhaps even knowledge of her bloodline. If so, their eradication was not just religious, it was an attempt to silence history itself. The same pattern repeated with the Knights Templar. Once allies of the papacy, they became too wealthy, too powerful, too independent, and perhaps too dangerous. When King Philip IV of France conspired with Pope Clement V to dismantle the order in 1307, it was not only a political move to seize their riches. It was also an opportunity to crush a group long suspected of harboring dangerous knowledge. Tortured confession spoke of strange rituals, secret relics, and blasphemous worship, accusations the Church trumpeted as proof of corruption. Yet beneath the propaganda lurked a more chilling question: were the Templars silenced because they knew too much about the Grail, the Magdalene, and the bloodline of Christ? Rome's fear was not unfounded. A living descendant of Jesus would have posed the ultimate challenge to papal supremacy. Popes claimed to be the vicars of Christ, his sole representatives on earth. But what if his descendants still walked among humanity? Who would be the true heirs of his legacy, the bishops of Rome, or his flesh and blood? This was the nightmare that haunted the Vatican. And so, for centuries, the Church acted not only as shepherd of souls, but as a hunter of secrets. Evidence of this campaign appears in subtle ways. Entire archive was sealed, Gospels forbidden, manuscripts destroyed. Medieval chroniclers who hinted at Magdalene's prominence were branded heretics. Even art was policed, with depictions of Magdalene carefully adjusted to fit her penitential image. Painters who dared to suggest intimacy between her and Christ often faced censorship. The Magdalene who survived in Catholic imagination was a weeping sin at Christ's feet, not an equal partner, never a wife, never a mother. But suppression only fueled suspicion. Why was a Magdalene so relentlessly diminished? Why did the Church devote such energy to controlling her image, her story, her legacy? The vehemence of the campaign suggests not mere theological concern, but fear that if the truth ever emerged, it could unravel the Church's authority in a single stroke. And so, Rome struck back, again and again, against the Cathars, against the Templars, against mystics and heretics who claimed visions of a feminine Christ, against writers who dared suggest that the Grail was not a chalice but a womb. Each time, the Church used its arsenal of power: inquisitions, crusades, excommunications, and executions. It was a war fought not only on battlefields but in libraries, pulpits, and hearts. Yet despite all efforts, the whispers endured. The very violence of the Church's response ensured that rumors of hidden truth survived. For every gospel burned, another surfaced in a cave. For every heretic silenced, another whispered the story to the next generation. Rome had immense power, but secrecy has its own resilience. What cannot be proved cannot be destroyed. It can only be hidden, waiting to re-emerge. By the Renaissance, as Europe began to rediscover forgotten texts and challenge papal authority, the Magdalene shadow returned. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci painted Last Suppers with ambiguous figures that some claimed showed Magdalene beside Christ. Scholars began to question why so many Gospels were excluded from the canon. And in the modern age, when archives opened and archaeology advanced, the possibility of a bloodline once again rose to the surface. Rome could never bury it completely. The Church's fear, then, was not paranoia. It was recognition of a truth too dangerous to risk. That the story they told was not the only story. That beneath the official narrative ran another current, one that spoke of a family, a lineage, and a very different vision of Christianity. And so Rome struck back, again and again, not only against heretics, but against history itself. But if the Church worked tirelessly to erase this truth, what of those who sought to reveal it? What of the writers, thinkers, and rebels who dared to imagine a different story, one in which Magdalene's voice was not silenced but heard? To follow their trail is to enter the dangerous world of heresy and revelation, where truth seekers risk their lives to preserve the possibility of Christ's hidden bloodline. When we open the Bible today, we see 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They tell the story of Jesus in harmony with the Church's teachings, carefully woven into a single, unified message. But what is less known, deliberately hidden for centuries, is that dozens of other Gospels once existed. They were read by early Christians, copied by hand, cherished in communities across the Mediterranean. And many of these texts painted a very different picture of Christ, his followers, and most of all, Mary Magdalene. These are the so-called lost Gospels, condemned as heretical by church councils and cast into obscurity. For centuries, they survived only in fragments, in hints from critics who quoted them in order to refute them. But every so often, one resurfaced, giving us a glimpse of the Christianity that Rome tried to erase. And what we find in these texts is not only shocking, it is revolutionary. Take the Gospel of Philip, discovered in the sands of Egypt as part of the Nag Hammadi Library in 1945. This collection of Gnostic writings had been hidden away in jars for more than 1,500 years, a time capsule buried by monks who feared Rome's wrath. In Philip's Gospel, Mary Magdalene appears not as a penitent sinner, but as Jesus' most beloved companion. The text refers to her as his partner and suggests an intimacy the canonical Gospels never admit. One passage even describes Jesus kissing her often, provoking jealousy among the male disciples. Here, Magdalene is not marginal. She is central, a figure of authority whose closeness to Christ made others uneasy. Then there is the Gospel of Mary, another stunning text that gives Magdalene a voice of her own. In it, after Jesus departs, the disciples are left fearful and uncertain. It is Mary who steps forward, encouraging them, teaching them, reminding them of Christ's words. She shares a vision of spiritual truth entrusted to her alone. But when she speaks, Peter challenges her, dismissing the idea that a woman could hold such authority. Yet Levi defends her, saying that if Christ found her worthy, who are men to reject her? It is a moment of raw honesty, revealing a tension at the very birth of Christianity, between those who would silence Magdalene and those who would honor her. Other texts, too, lift the veil. The Gospel of Thomas, a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus, speaks of hidden knowledge and an inner kingdom found within. Though it does not directly mention Magdalene, it reflects a spirituality more mystical than institutional, closer to what Gnostic Christians taught. The Pistis Sophia, another ancient text, records long dialogues between Jesus and his disciples, with Magdalene asking question after question, sometimes more than all the others combined. She is portrayed as wise, insightful, a true seeker of truth, not the repentant sinner Rome would later craft. What unites these lost Gospels is their challenge to the version of Christianity the Church built. They elevate inner wisdom over external authority. They highlight feminine figures, especially Magdalene, as bearers of knowledge. They suggest that Jesus' message was not about creating a rigid institution, but about awakening the divine spark within each soul. For Rome, this was intolerable. Such ideas threatened the hierarchy, the sacraments, the very notion of a church's gatekeeper of salvation. So the Gospels were banned. Councils declared them heretical. Copies were burned. Those who read them were excommunicated, hunted, sometimes executed. By the 4th century, when Emperor Constantine allied himself with Christianity and the Council of Nicaea codified the canon, the fate of the lost Gospels was sealed. Only the approved texts remained, and with them, a version of history that diminished Magdalene and erased any hint of Christ's bloodline. Yet the lost Gospels refused to vanish entirely. Monks and mystics hid them, sometimes in caves, sometimes in libraries, waiting for a time when it might be safe to reveal them again. The discovery at Nag Hammadi was not an accident. It was the unearthing of suppressed history, voices speaking across centuries to remind us that Christianity was never one story, but many. And what these voices reveal is striking. If Magdalene was indeed Jesus' closest companion, if she was entrusted with visions and teachings, then the idea of her as wife or mother becomes far more plausible. The Church's portrayal of her as a prostitute begins to look not only false but intentional, a smear campaign designed to diminish her role. The lost Gospels, then, are more than texts. They are evidence of a cover-up, fragments of a history in which Magdalene was silenced precisely because she mattered too much. For modern readers, these discoveries are electrifying. They show us a Christianity that could have been, a faith where women held equal authority, where spirituality was inward and mystical, where the bloodline of Christ may have been acknowledged rather than denied. They also show us the ferocity of Rome's fear, the lengths to which the Church went to silence not only people, but words themselves. And yet, the Gospels endure, their voices growing loud in our age of rediscovery. They remind us that the story of Jesus is not simple, not singular, but contested, layered, alive with mystery. They also push us to ask, what else remains hidden? If these texts could survive underground for nearly 2 millennia, what other scrolls, relics, or genealogies might still be waiting? The lost Gospels challenge us not to accept history at face value. They whisper that truth is never completely buried, only waiting to be uncovered. And if Magdalene's suppressed voice is rising again in our time, perhaps it is because the world is finally ready to hear it. But lost Gospels alone do not prove the bloodline. They only suggest it, hint at it, give it possibility. To follow the trail further, we must turn to the darker arts of history, to codes hidden in art, to relics smuggled across Europe, to families who kept their secrets for centuries. In other words, we must enter a world of symbols and clues, where the greatest mysteries of all are often hidden in plain sight. Across Europe, towering cathedrals rise like stone giants, their spires piercing the heavens, their walls adorned with carvings of saints, angels, and biblical scenes. To the casual visitor, these masterpieces of medieval architecture seem like grand expressions of faith, monuments to Christianity's glory. But to those who know where to look, they are more than houses of worship. They are books written in stone, coded with symbols, hiding messages that were never meant for the masses. For centuries, cathedrals have functioned as vaults of secret knowledge, with masons and architects leaving behind silent testimonies carved into their walls. Consider the great Gothic cathedrals of France, Chartres, Notre Dame of Paris, Reims. Each is designed not merely for beauty, but for meaning. Their blueprints echo with sacred geometry, ratios drawn from ancient traditions, proportions believed to align earthly structures with divine order. Circles, triangles, and squares are not simply decorative but encode spiritual truths. The very floor plans resemble mandalas, pathways that guide the faithful inward toward the mystery of the divine. Chartres, in particular, is renowned for its labyrinth, a stone pathway inlaid into the floor. Pilgrims would walk it slowly, tracing a symbolic journey of the soul toward God. But to initiates, The labyrinth carried other meanings, a hidden symbol of the journey towards secret knowledge, perhaps even the path of those who carried the bloodline of Christ. Within the cathedrals, the stained glass windows glow with stories, their colors illuminating not only biblical events but also allegories rich with symbolic resonance. Some depict Magdalene not as a fallen woman, but as a saintly figure, a witness to the resurrection. In Chartres, a window shows her with a vessel of ointment, the so-called holy oil, but scholars have noted that the vessel resembles a chalice, the very image that later came to symbolize the Holy Grail. Was this an accident, or a quiet nod from the glassmakers to a secret tradition that associated Magdalene with the Grail, not as a cup, but as a womb, the vessel of Christ's bloodline? Then there are the gargoyles, grotesque figures leering from the heights of Notre Dame. Officially, they are explained as waterspouts or as symbolic guardians warding off evil. Yet some of their forms are so strange, so monstrous, that they seem to speak another language altogether. To esoteric traditions, these creatures were reminders that truth is laid, that beneath the sacred is a profane, and within the holy lies a shadow. The masons who carved and belonged to guilds with their own symbols, codes, and oaths, many of which survive today in Freemasonry. These guilds preserved knowledge of geometry, astronomy, and allegory, passing it from generation to generation, embedding it into the very stones of the cathedrals they built. One of the most intriguing symbols repeated in cathedrals is the rose window. These massive circular stained glass works resemble wheels of light, often placed at the entrance of the nave. The rose is an ancient symbol, tied to Venus, to love, to secrecy. In medieval iconography, it also became a symbol of Mary. Yet which Mary? The Virgin, certainly, but also, perhaps, Magdalene. Some traditions whisper that the rose window was a veiled tribute to her, the hidden bride, her presence acknowledged but never spoken. The very term sub rosa, under the rose, meant secrecy, a knowledge kept hidden from the uninitiated. The Knights Templar, those warrior monks who once held immense power, also left their mark on Europe's sacred architecture. Many of their chapels contain unusual carvings, two knights riding a single horse, enigmatic figures with chalices, even depictions of vines and roses intertwined. To some, these are merely ornamental. To others, they are codes, symbols pointing to the Templars' most guarded secret, the protection of Christ's descendants, a bloodline they believed was sacred. When the Templars were suppressed in 1307, much of their knowledge vanished into legend, but their legacy lingers in stone, waiting for careful eyes to read it. Secret codes were not limited to architecture. Medieval manuscripts, too, contained hidden messages written in illuminated initials, marginal drawings, and acrostics. Artists and scribes often worked under the gaze of the church but embedded subtle hints of alternative truths. A letter shaped like a chalice, a flower curling around a figure of Magdalene, a tiny depiction of a child with an unusual halo. These details, easy to miss, may have been a quiet rebellion of artists who knew more than they dared to say aloud. Even Leonardo da Vinci, centuries later, would follow this tradition. His paintings are filled with gestures, gazes, and placements that seem to hint at hidden meanings, the most famous being the Last Supper, where Mary Magdalene is believed by some to sit beside Christ, disguised as John the Apostle. Whether intentional or not, such art carries the same essence as the cathedrals, a layering of meanings, one for the faithful, another for the initiated. For the ordinary worshipper, a cathedral was a place of awe, of incense and song, of ritual that connected heaven and earth. But for the initiated, it was also a book of secrets. Each carving, each stained glass panel, each proportion of stone carried meaning. It was a library that could not be burned, a text that could not be censored, for its words were not written in ink but in architecture. And so, across Europe, from the 12th to the 15th century, the masons and builders left us a trail. They spoke in geometry, in roses and labyrinths, in chalices and coded figures. They wove Magdalene into the very fabric of Christian sacred space, not openly but in whispers of glass and stone. To stand in these cathedrals today is to stand inside a mystery, surrounded by clues that speak of a Christianity deeper than the official story. But symbols alone are not enough. They are tantalizing, suggestive, but they require interpretation. If the cathedrals hint at Magdalene's hidden role in the bloodline of Christ, we must ask, who carried this knowledge forward, and how? The answer lies not in stone, but in flesh, in families who guarded secrets for centuries, weaving them into their lineages, their coats of arms, their stories. Families who may have carried the blood of Christ himself. History is written not only in chronicles and scriptures, but also in flesh and blood. Dynasties rise and fall, empires expand and collapse. Yet through it all, bloodlines endure, carrying with them secrets, alliances, and destinies that shape the course of nations. If the idea of a sacred bloodline descending from Jesus and Mary Magdalene is more than myth, then its preservation would have been entrusted not to churches or institutions, but to families. These families, bound by lineage and sworn to secrecy, would hold in their veins the most explosive truth of all, that divinity itself had mingled with humanity. We begin in the south of France, where legend holds that Mary Magdalene fled after the crucifixion, perhaps with a child. Here, in Provence and the Languedoc, stories speak of her preaching, living in caves, and leaving behind a legacy that mingled with the noble families of the region. The Counts of Toulouse, the Viscounts of Carcassonne, and other Occitan lords were patrons of a culture that celebrated knowledge, poetry, and heresy, those very qualities that the Church sought to extinguish. It is here, among the Cathars and troubadours, that whispers of a hidden bloodline first took root. The Merovingians, the first great dynasty of Frankish kings, are often drawn into the story. Ruling from the 5th to the 8th centuries, they were seen as sacred kings, their long hair a symbol of divine power. Medieval chronicles describe them as semi-mystical figures, descended from a sea creature or divine being, but some modern theories suggest this legend veiled another truth, that they were descended from a line sanctified not by myth but by blood, perhaps even the blood of Christ. The Merovingians ruled with charisma and mystery, and when their dynasty was eventually replaced by the Carolingians, their aura did not vanish. Instead, legends of their sacred heritage lingered, woven into the folklore of France. Centuries later, families such as the Planted Line would claim descent from the Merovingians, stirring intrigue and controversy. The so-called Priory of Sion documents, whether genuine or forged, painted a picture of secret guardians of Christ's bloodline, hiding in plain sight within Europe's aristocracy. Names like St. Clair, de Gizzes, and Blanchefort appear in connection with these claims. Families that held land in the Languedoc, near the very heart of Catholic resistance in the shadow of Rennes-le-Château. Coincidence or inheritance? The Cathars themselves, destroyed in the brutal Albigensian crusade of the 13th century, were accused of holding heretical beliefs about Christ and Magdalene. Rumors swirled that they guarded a secret treasure, not gold but knowledge, a lineage that threatened the authority of Rome. When Montségur fell in 1244, legends say a small group of Cathars slipped away with a great secret. Was it manuscripts? Was it relics? Or was it something far more human, the safeguarding of a bloodline? Later still, the Knights Templar, deeply connected with Languedoc and with Cathar families, would be accused of heresy themselves. Their sudden rise, vast wealth, and mysterious initiation rites suggested they too carried hidden knowledge. Some have speculated that their true treasure was not the Grail as a cup but the Grail as a bloodline. If so, they may have protected the descendants of Christ, ensuring their survival through Europe's darkest centuries. In Scotland, too, whispers of the sacred bloodline arise. The Sinclair family of Rosslyn, famous for their chapel adorned with enigmatic carvings, is said to have had ties to the Templars. Rosslyn Chapel's imagery, green men, stars, biblical figures with strange gestures, has long intrigued researchers. Some believe it was built as a shrine not to Orthodox Christianity but to a deeper truth carried by the Sinclair bloodline, a truth that resonated with the same whispers of Magdalene and the Grail. Other noble houses across Europe appear in these legends: the Habsburgs, the Stuarts, the Bourbons, dynasties where the idea of divine right was not simply a political convenience but perhaps a shadow of something older, more profound. Could it be that the legitimacy of kingship was tied not merely to political power but to descent, however faint, from a line that began in Galilee? If so, the wars, marriages, and betrayals of Europe's ruling houses take on an entirely new dimension, not just struggles for thrones, but battles over the guardianship of a holy inheritance. Even coats of arms and family symbols have been scrutinized for clues. The fleur-de-lis, long associated with French royalty, is often interpreted as a stylized lily, but some argue it also symbolizes a chalice, the vessel, the Grail. The rose, seen in both English and continental heraldry, carries echoes of Magdalene's hidden symbolism. Could it be that noble families declare their allegiance to the hidden truth not through words, which could be silenced, but through symbols which could endure unnoticed? Yet the survival of such a bloodline would not have been easy. Europe's history is littered with purges, inquisitions, and dynastic purges. To carry the blood of Christ would have been both a blessing and a curse, an inheritance of sacred power, but also a target for those who wish to control, suppress, or destroy it. Families who bore this legacy would have needed to blend into the tapestry of nobility, hiding their truth beneath layers of genealogy and myth. They may have known their heritage not in public proclamation, but in whispered traditions, private rituals, and secret alliances. The notion of bloodlines raises uncomfortable questions. If such families exist, or existed, why have they remained silent? Why not claim their legacy openly? The answer may lie in the weight of history. To claim descent from Christ would have been to challenge the Church itself, to undermine centuries of theology built upon the divinity of Jesus divorced from his humanity. It would have meant war, persecution, and annihilation. Silence, then, was survival. And so, the threads of these families win through history, sometimes visible, sometimes vanishing, but always returning in legend, whether through the Merovingians, the Cathars, the Templars, or the noble houses of Europe. The idea persists that a secret bloodline has endured, carrying within it the potential to upend everything we believe about Christianity and history. But dynasties are not only about blood, they are about stories. And where bloodlines are hidden, stories often carry their weight. To trace the survival of Christ's descendants, one must follow not just genealogies, but legends, folklore, and local traditions passed down in whispers. The people may forget the names, but the tales endure, pointing towards something too powerful to vanish entirely. And so we must follow the trail further, from families of flesh to treasures of myth. If Christ's bloodline endured, it may not only be recorded in human veins, but also symbolize in the greatest treasure hunt of all, the quest for the Holy Grail. Few symbols in Western history have captured the imagination as powerfully as the Holy Grail. For centuries, poets, knights, scholars, and seekers have pursued it, often at the cost of their lives. The Grail appears in medieval romances as a chalice of shimmering light, the vessel from which Christ drank at the Last Supper, or the cup that caught his blood at the crucifixion. Yet beneath this image lies a deeper mystery. What if the Grail was never a cup at all? What if it was a metaphor, one that concealed the greatest secret of all, a bloodline? The Grail legend first appears in the writings of Chrétien de Troyes in the late 12th century. His unfinished poem speaks of a mystical object carried in a procession, a vessel of immense power. Later writers like Wolfram von Eschenbach expanded the legend, weaving in knights, quests, and guardians. Eschenbach, in particular, claimed the Grail was not a cup but a stone, a lapsit exilis, with life-giving properties. This diversity of imagery suggests that the Grail was never meant to be literal. It was a symbol, shifting, elusive, carrying meanings that could only be understood by the initiated. By the 13th century, the Grail had become entwined with the Arthurian cycle, with knights like Percival and Galahad tasked to seek it as the ultimate test of purity and worth. Yet scholars have long noted that these tales emerge from the very regions where Cathar heresy flourished, southern France, the Languedoc, the Pyrenees. The same soil that bore legends of Magdalene also birthed the Grail romances. Was this coincidence? Or were the troubadours and poets encoding forbidden truths in allegory? The word Grail itself offers tantalizing clues. In Old French, Graal or Gradalis referred to a dish or vessel, often large and communal. But some theorists have connected it with Sangreal, royal blood. Over time, Sangreal could have been contracted into Sangraal, transforming the meaning from holy blood to Holy Grail. If so, then every Grail quest was not for a relic of wood or gold, but for lineage. The quest was for the bloodline of Christ, hidden, protected, and passed down through generations. The imagery of the chalice aligns perfectly with this interpretation. A chalice is not only a cup but also a vessel. In Christian ritual, it holds wine, symbolizing the blood of Christ. But in symbolic language, a vessel also represents the womb, the feminine principle, the container of life itself. If Magdalene was a Grail, then she was not simply a companion of Jesus. She was a vessel of his blood, the one who carried his lineage into the future. The Grail, then, was not an object to be found, but a truth to be recognized. that divinity flowed through human blood. Guardians of the Grail appear throughout history. In the romances, mysterious knights or hermits guard the sacred object. In reality, the guardians may have been families, orders, or secret societies who preserved knowledge of the bloodline. The Knights Templar, with their hidden rituals and sudden downfall, are often linked to the Grail. Wolfram von Eschenbach even refers to Templars as keepers of the Grail, suggesting a direct connection between the order and the legend. If the Templars were indeed protectors of Christ's descendants, then their true treasure was never gold but the bloodline itself. Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland adds another layer to the Grail mystery. Built by the Sinclair family in the 15th century, the chapel's intricate carvings have been interpreted as hints toward both Templar secrets and Grail lore. Some claim its architecture encodes a very idea of the Grail as bloodline, with imagery of vines, chalices, and hidden figures that suggest continuity of a sacred family. Legends even speak of relics or documents buried beneath the chapel, waiting for discovery. Modern literature has revived these ideas. Books like Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and even popular novels such as the Vinci Code have argued that the Grail is symbolic of Magdalene and the bloodline. While scholars dismiss many of these claims as speculative, the sheer persistence of the theory reveals something important. The Grail resonates not because it is a cup, but because it represents a union of heaven and earth, divinity and humanity, spirit and blood. The Grail's role in chivalric romances reflects this duality. Knights who sought it had to prove not only their bravery, but their purity of heart. The quest was spiritual as much as physical. This mirrors a notion of a bloodline hidden in plain sight, protected not by walls or armies, but by the purity and faith of those who carried it. To reach the Grail was to be transformed, to see beyond symbols to the truth that lay behind them. Even the Church, which officially dismissed Grail legends as myth, may have sensed the danger they posed. If the Grail was understood as Christ's bloodline, it undermined the very foundations of church authority. Power rested in sacraments, relics, and papal succession. But what if true divine authority resided in human descendants, outside the control of Rome? Such an idea was heresy of the highest order, capable of destabilizing centuries of doctrine. The persistence of the Grail myth across centuries suggests that it encodes something vital. Myths endure not because they are fanciful, but because they carry truths too powerful to be forgotten. The Grail, in all its forms, cup, stone, dish, womb, speaks to the union of the divine with the human. It invites seekers not to search for an object, but to uncover a hidden reality. Perhaps that reality is the survival of a bloodline, carried in silence across generations, whispered of in poetry and carved into stone, awaiting recognition. And so, the Grail is not the end of the story, but a key. It is a bridge between symbol and flesh, between legend and history. To understand the Grail is to understand that if Christ's bloodline survived, it was hidden not in chalices or stones, but in people, flesh and bone, mothers and children, families and dynasties. The Grail was never a cup to be found, but a truth to be revealed. From Hay, the trail leads us from the age of chivalry into the hidden chambers of secret societies. For if the Grail was a bloodline, then who ensured its survival across centuries of persecution? Who carried the torch through the dark ages of history, keeping alive a secret that could shatter the foundations of Christianity? The answer lies not in legend, but in organizations sworn to silence, the guardians of mysteries who kept the bloodline hidden in the shadows of power. Throughout history, whenever truth threatened power, it was forced into the shadows. Knowledge that could not be openly declared was passed in whispers, symbols, and rituals. If the bloodline of Christ truly survived, then it would have needed protection not just from time and chance, but from the full force of the church, kings, and empires. That protection, many believe, came through secret societies, networks of initiates who vowed to guard the mystery until the world was ready to hear it. The most famous of these guardians were the Knights Templar. Founded in the early 12th century, the Templars were warrior monks sworn to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land. But behind their austere vows and military campaigns, they amassed immense wealth and influence. They built fortresses, created Europe's first international banking system, and answered only to the Pope. Their secrecy was legendary, their initiation rites whispered about but never fully revealed. And when they fell in 1307, accused of heresy and idol worship, their true secrets were never uncovered. Some scholars suggest that downfall was orchestrated precisely because they knew something dangerous, perhaps the truth of the bloodline, perhaps evidence that Jesus' legacy was not what Rome had proclaimed. After the Templars were destroyed, rumors persisted that their knowledge survived. Some believed they carried it to Scotland, merging with noble families like the Sinclairs and leaving hints in Rosslyn Chapel. Others say it flowed into the veins of Freemasonry, which rose centuries later with symbols echoing those of the Templars, compasses, squares, and secret handshakes. Freemasonry, officially a fraternity of builders and philosophers, was accused by the Church of harboring heresies. Its rituals, laced with biblical imagery and allegory, may have been more than symbolic. They may have been veiled transmissions of truths too dangerous to speak openly. Then there's the shadowy Priory of Sion, an organization that burst into public consciousness in the 20th century through controversial documents discovered in France. These papers claimed the priory had existed since the Middle Ages, dedicated to protecting the descendants of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Though many historians dismiss the documents as hoaxes, the names tied to the priory are real: noble families, scholars, and artists who shaped European culture. Whether fact or fabrication, the idea that a society existed to shield a bloodline has fueled decades of speculation. The Rosicrucians, too, entered the stage in the 17th century with manifestos promising hidden wisdom, blending Christian mysticism, alchemy, and esoteric philosophy. Their teaching spoke of secret knowledge that would transform humanity, a perfect echo of the idea that within blood or lineage lay salvation. Their appearance sparked rumors that they were the heirs of the Templars, the keepers of mysteries stretching back to Christ himself. Why would such societies exist at all? Because truth, once buried, must have guardians. The bloodline theory suggests that Jesus' descendants could not survive unprotected. In a world where heresy meant death, silence was not cowardice but survival. To safeguard a family line, secrecy had to be absolute, hidden behind coded rituals, passed down only to the initiated. The symbols of these societies, roses, crosses, compasses, chalices, may not have been arbitrary decorations but emblems of their charge, to protect the legacy of Christ's union with Magdalene. And yet, secrecy breeds suspicion. Across centuries, the church and monarchs have waged war on such groups, branding them as heretics, sorcerers, and conspirators. But what if these accusations were deflections? What if the real danger they posed was not sorcery, but the unveiling of a truth that could overturn the pillars of power? If a divine bloodline existed, then papal succession, priestly authority, even the very foundation of salvation as the church defined it would crumble. Guardianship, then, was not only a sacred duty but a dangerous one. Even in modern times, whispers of secret societies persist. Freemasons remain active, their lodges scattered across the world, their symbolism visible on everything from architecture to currency. The Priory of Sion, real or invented, has inspired countless books, films, and theories. And beneath it all, the same question lingers. Are these just romantic fantasies, or is there a hidden network that has preserved the bloodline into the present day? The allure of secret societies lies in their duality. They are both real organizations with members, rituals, and influence, and mythic repositories of projected hopes and faiths. They embody humanity's instinct to protect what is sacred by wrapping it in silence. And in the case of the bloodline, their existence suggests that some truths are too dangerous to be revealed in daylight, surviving only in the coded language of the initiated. If these groups truly carried the secret of the bloodline, then they were not only protectors but decision-makers, choosing when and if to reveal their truth. Perhaps they wait for a time when the world is ready, when faith will not collapse at the revelation that Christ had heirs. Or perhaps they have already revealed it, piece by piece, throughout architecture and story, allowing the secret to survive without ever fully surfacing. But the story does not end with guardianship, for secrets hidden too long begin to seep out, bleeding into folklore, resurfacing in unexpected places. In France, a tiny hilltop village would one day ignite a storm of speculation, its name forever tied to the mystery of the bloodline. A place where buried treasure, coded parchments, and whispers of Magdalene converge, Rennes Chateau. High in the foothills of the Pyrenees lies a small French village that should have remained obscure, just another dot on the map of southern France. Yet Rennes Chateau has become one of the most mysterious places in modern history, a focal point for legends of treasure, coded messages, and the survival of Jesus' bloodline. At its center was a single man, a parish priest named Berenger Saunier, whose sudden wealth and strange behavior ignited a firestorm of speculation that continues to this day. In 1885, Saunier took charge of the tiny parish. The church dedicated to Mary Magdalene was crumbling, neglected, and nearly forgotten. Saunier, a man of modest means, should have lived out his life quietly, serving a poor rural congregation. But within a few short years, something extraordinary happened. He began pouring money into lavish renovations of the church and surrounding estate. He built a grand villa, a strange tower called the Tour Magdala, and filled his church with bizarre imagery, statues of demons, cryptic Latin inscriptions, and symbols that seemed deliberately designed to puzzle the observer. Where did a humble priest acquire such wealth, and why did he cloak his church in riddles? The official story offered by the church was vague. They claimed Saunier engaged in trafficking in masses, accepting money from patrons to say prayers for the dead, far more than regulations allowed. But this explanation has never satisfied investigators. The sheer scale of his spending went far beyond what such practices could have produced. Saunier lived like a man who had stumbled upon something hidden, something worth a fortune. The mystery deepens with the claim that during his renovations, Saunier discovered parchments hidden within the church. These documents, said to contain genealogies and coded texts, hinted at secrets that could destabilize the foundations of the Catholic Church. Some researchers suggest these parchments reveal the survival of a royal bloodline descended from Jesus and Mary Magdalene, protected in southern France for centuries. If Saunier uncovered proof of this lineage, it would explain both his sudden wealth and his need for secrecy. Perhaps he was paid handsomely to remain silent. His renovations themselves became a coded testament. The church's entrance was marked by the phrase Terribilis Locusis, "This is a terrible place, a chilling welcome for a house of worship." Statues depicted not only saints but also demons and bizarre biblical juxtapositions. Most famously, Saunier placed a statue of the demon Asmodeus, guardian of hidden treasure, inside the entrance. Was this a mocking gesture, a clue, or a warning? Every detail seemed intentional, as though Saunier wanted future generations to search for meaning in his choices. The Tour Magdala, his peculiar tower, only added to the enigma. Named after Mary Magdalene, it stood as a monument to the figure long rumored to be Christ's companion. Why build such a structure unless Saunier was deliberately honoring her, or pointing to her importance in the mystery he had uncovered? The secrecy did not die with him. Saunier's housekeeper and confidant, Marie Dinano, lived in his villa until her death in 1953. On her deathbed, she reportedly tried to confess a great secret to a local official, but she collapsed before finishing her words. Her silence left behind only rumors that she, too, knew the truth of Saunier's fortune and the secret of Rennes-le-Château. The story might have faded into obscurity if not for the explosion of interest in the mid-20th century. Writers and researchers began connecting Rennes-le-Château to the Priory of Sion and the theory of Christ's bloodline. Books like Holy Blood, Holy Grail wove Saunier's mystery into a tapestry of European conspiracies, linking the priest's wealth to a secret so explosive it had to be buried beneath layers of deception. Was Rennes-le-Château not just a village, but a vault of forbidden history? Skeptics argue Saunier's wealth was more mundane, the result of financial misdeeds and gullible donors. They dismiss the parchments as later inventions, fabricated to attract attention. But the skeptics cannot explain the enduring strangeness of the church's symbolism, nor why the story refuses to die. For believers, Rennes-le-Château remains a visible scar where history tried to bury the truth but failed. Even the geography adds to the sense of hidden meaning. The surrounding landscape is dotted with ancient ruins, stone circles, and caves once used by the Cathars, a heretical sect crushed by the Church in the Middle Ages. Legends claim the Cathars themselves guarded a great treasure, not of gold, but of knowledge, possibly linked to the Magdalene and her descendants. Rennes-le-Château sits at the heart of this landscape, as though chosen deliberately. Tourists and treasure hunters still flock to the village, hoping to uncover what Saunier may have found. Some dig in the hills, others study the symbols of the church, while others pore over archives, convinced the truth is hidden in plain sight. To this day, the French authorities restrict excavations, perhaps wary of what might be uncovered, or what rumors might ignite. The Rennes-le-Château mystery stands as one of the most tantalizing crossroads in the story of the bloodline. If Saunier found proof of Christ's descendants, then the truth was discovered once before, only to be buried again. If he found treasure, it may have been treasure of the mind, documents, genealogies, evidence of a story long suppressed. His life, his wealth, and his strange choices suggest he was a man caught between revelation and silence, between knowledge and danger. The village itself remains like a stage set, its stones whispering secrets no one has fully unlocked. And yet, the possibility lingers that within its church or beneath its hills lies the greatest revelation of all, the proof that the bloodline of Christ survived, and that it was protected for centuries in the very land where Mary Magdalene was once said to have fled. From this village of secrets, the story expands outward again, to the families and dynasties who may have carried that blood. If the line survived, it would not remain hidden in rural obscurity. It would flow into the veins of kings, shaping the destinies of nations. And nowhere is this possibility more compelling than in the legend of the Merovingians, the ancient dynasty of France said to be the very heirs of Christ. Long before the age of cathedrals, crusades, and popes who ruled as kings, there rose in Europe a dynasty that seemed touched by something otherworldly. They were the Merovingians, the first great royal house of the Franks, who ruled much of what is now France and Germany between the 5th and 8th centuries. To many medieval chroniclers, they were no ordinary kings. They were described as mysterious, semi-divine, endowed with powers of prophecy and healing, and marked by a strange, almost supernatural aura. But perhaps their most enduring mystery is the claim that their bloodline was not merely noble, it was sacred. For in the whispers of secret traditions, the Merovingians were said to be the descendants of Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene. The story of the Merovingians begins with a figure cloaked in myth, Merovec, the dynasty's legendary founder. His name gave the family their title, but his origins were anything but ordinary. Chroniclers claim that his mother was visited by a strange sea creature. Some called it a beast, others a divine force, while swimming in the ocean. When she returned, she was with child. Thus, Merovec was born of two fathers, a human king and something beyond human understanding. Whether this tale was meant to encode allegory, or to suggest that the blood of Merovec carried something extraordinary, it gave the dynasty a mystical origin that set them apart from the other barbarian rulers of Europe. What made the Merovingians different was not just their legend but their rule. Unlike later monarchs who centralized power, the Merovingians shared it. Kings often divided lands among sons, creating overlapping territories. Yet despite the fragmentation, their dynasty lasted centuries, bound by something stronger than law, the sense of divine destiny. They were called the long-haired kings, for they refused to cut their hair, seeing it as a source of strength, a physical sign of their sacred bloodline. Cutting their hair was considered an act of humiliation, a stripping of their legitimacy. Historians often portray them as tribal warlords elevated by conquest, but in secret traditions, they were far more. Some claim the Merovingians were protectors of hidden knowledge, inheritors of wisdom brought from the Holy Land by refugees in the 1st century. Their name itself has been linked to the sea, Mer in French, and by extension to the Magdalene, whose legend is deeply rooted in the southern coast of France. Coincidence? Or a deliberate clue left by history? By the 20th century, researchers began to weave together the strands, Rennes Chateau, the Magdalene traditions, and the sudden rise of the Merovingian dynasty. Could it be that Mary Magdalene's descendants integrated with local nobility, and that their bloodline eventually gave rise to the Merovingians? If so, then the rulers of France in the Dark Ages were not merely political figures, but the living heirs of Christ himself. This idea electrified those searching for hidden truths, for it meant the sacred bloodline was not just myth but flesh and bone, seated on the thrones of Europe. Yet the Merovingian story is also one of betrayal and suppression. By the 8th century, their power had weakened, and real authority fell to their mayors of the palace, ambitious stewards who ruled in the king's name. Among them was Charles Martel, the grandfather of Charlemagne. Eventually, the church supported the overthrow of the Merovingians in favor of the Carolingians, a dynasty it could more easily control. The last Merovingian king, Childeric III, was dethroned and forced into a monastery. His hair was cut, symbolically severing the sacred line. But was it really destroyed? Some claim the bloodline went underground, surviving in secret, hidden among noble families of Europe. Genealogists have traced links, sometimes tenuous, sometimes startling, between the Merovingians and later houses such as the Plantagenets, the Habsburgs, and other European royals. If true, the sacred line may still exist, hidden in plain sight, woven into the very fabric of Europe's aristocracy. The artifacts left behind by the Merovingians only add fuel to the fire. The tomb of Childeric I, discovered in the 17th century, contained golden bees, symbols later adopted by Napoleon when he sought to legitimize his rule by connecting himself to ancient dynasties. Why bees? Some suggest they represented resurrection and immortality, an echo of a bloodline that could not be extinguished. Others point to their association with the goddess, with wisdom, and with the idea of a divine feminine power that recalls Mary Magdalene. Even stranger are the persistent legends that the Merovingians possessed healing powers, especially the ability to cure the sick by laying on hands. Some were said to be able to foresee the future, or to commune with nature in uncanny ways. To their people, these were not ordinary kings. There was something closer to priest-kings, guardians of a sacred flame. If these traditions were echoes of their supposed lineage from Christ, then their reign was both political and spiritual. Modern writers have not missed the potential. Works like Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and countless speculative histories argue that the suppression of the Merovingians was not merely a political coup, but an effort to erase their connection to Christ's bloodline. If the Church had allowed the truth to stand, that living descendants of Jesus existed, and that they ruled as kings, then the very foundation of papal authority would crumble. For who could claim to be the representative of Christ on earth when Christ's heirs still walked the earth themselves? The Merovingian mystery ties the story together. Rennes Chateau, the Magdalene traditions, the Priory of Sion, and the endless rumors of a hidden bloodline all converge on this dynasty. They embody the possibility that Jesus' legacy was not spiritual alone but dynastic, a lineage that shaped kingdoms and altered the course of European history. But as with all things in this tale, the truth remains elusive. Were the Merovingians truly descendants of Christ, or were they rulers who skillfully wrapped themselves in myth to legitimize their power? Was the legend of their sacred bloodline an invention of later centuries, retroactively grafted onto their history? Or was it an open secret, too dangerous to admit, that survived in whispers and symbols? What is undeniable is the power of their legend. The very fact that their name continues to spark debate 1,000 years after their fall suggests that something extraordinary clings to them. Whether myth, truth, or a blend of both, the Merovingians remain the dynasty that refuses to die, at least in memory. From the ruins of their kingdom, the story of the bloodline does not end. If anything, it expands outward, hidden among the secret societies and underground currents of Europe. If the Merovingians were indeed heirs of Christ, then their downfall did not erase the bloodline. It merely forced it into the shadows, protected and concealed until the time was right to emerge once more. And that leads us to the final question. If the bloodline survived, who carries it now? And what would it mean if the truth were revealed in our time?